Chapter 942. There were two reasons for the silence of the spectators. The first was naturally because of Lycurgard's promise. Even when she could have taken back her freedom in the end, she gave up because of the promise in her heart. The spectators in these forums asked themselves if they were in that environment, they would not have been able to do this no matter what. The second reason was that they were silent because of the military governor's chaos flying immortal at the end. In the absence of the sword element, this sword had become so terrifying. If the military governor used the sword element, wouldn't it be possible for even an immortal sword wielder to be defeated by the sword of the military governor? It was said that a few days later, the sword spirit, known as the #1 sword master, saw this video. After a few hours of silence in the room, he said to his friend, "From today onwards, the #1 sword master is not him, the sword spirit, but the military governor in the game." With the words of the perplexed sword spirit, the video of the last battle with Jean quickly spread among all humans. It was said that almost all the sword bearers had seen this video. Even those sword bearers at the immortal sword tier were no exception. In the end, more than 90% of humans in the 8 base cities had seen this video, except for Jerusalem, which was difficult to calculate. Unexpectedly, the biggest beneficiary of this video was not the military governor, but Lycurgard. Because of Lycurgard's perfect performance of keeping her promise, coupled with her pair of huge opies that could suffocate a person to death, she instantly became a goddess in the eyes of all men and the representative of social sincerity. Almost overnight, she gained millions of fans, and the number of fans was still increasing. It could be said that she had replicated the legend of the rise of the military governor. At this time, more players were paying attention to the next battle of the military governor. Because there was only one spiritual sword wielder left who was ranked above Jean, everyone was almost certain that the military governor would definitely challenge that sword wielder. Even the sword wielder himself was secretly looking forward to the challenge of the military governor. He even told his friend that when the time came to challenge him, he would definitely beat the military governor, so that even his mother wouldn't recognize him, so that everyone would know that not using the sword element was a crooked way. It was a pity that this sword wielder never received a challenge message from the military governor. At first, the audience thought that this was just a replay of the previous battle with Lycurgard, and that the video would automatically appear after a few days. However, after waiting for a month, there were no new recordings. Only then did the spectators vaguely feel that the Admiral's journey of challenge had come to an end. The lively forum gradually returned to its peaceful state. However, the entire human world had changed because of the challenge of the military governor. The 8 base cities opened 8 swordmaster teaching classes at the same time, and the first generation of ordinary people who could fight with Yuan Ko were being trained. Of course, these had nothing to do with Gahan. At this time, Gahan was fighting in a dungeon. This was a dungeon that had never appeared in the history of the game, and it was also the second dungeon that Gahan conquered in a completely unfamiliar situation. After defeating Jean Dark that day, the unconscious Gahan was forced out of the game. He only fully recovered after resting for 3 days in the real world. But this was valuable because Guhan continued with the first move, Primal Chaos split the heavens, the second move, Primal Chaos stars, and finally created his third move, Primal Chaos flying immortal. The creation of Chaos Sky Splitter greatly improved Guhan's swordsmanship once again. Guhan even felt that if he met Gilgamesh again, he would not be as helpless as before. Gahan could at least fight with Gilgamesh for a few hundred rounds. However, the appearance of Chaos Sky Splitter also made Guhan understand that the way he fought with the Lady Sword Master without using the sword element was like the way he fought with the Wu people. It had lost its purpose, and it could no longer help Gahan further improve his swordsmanship. Guhan had to find a stronger opponent to fight against. Logically speaking, this was not a difficult task. Next, Gahan could use the identity of military governor to challenge those fairy sword wielders. However, he never expected that the sword committee would send an email directly to Gahan's personal terminal through Tomono Kakazi. The email clearly stated that Guhan was not allowed to challenge any legend of the sword and fairy level swordsman in the game. If Guhan dared to challenge any Legend of the Sword and Fairy level swordsman in the game, the Sword Committee would use its authority to ban the commander's account for 3 years. As for why Gahan was banned, the email did not explain clearly. However, when Gahan browsed through the various messages on the forum, he could roughly guess the reason why the Sword Committee did this. The reason was very simple. The Sword Committee was afraid that there would really be fairy sword wielders who would be defeated by military governor without using the sword element. This would undoubtedly cause a huge impact on the entire system of sword wielders. Military governor had defeated countless spirit sword wielders without using the sword element. This had broken the common sense that the Sword Committee had spent hundreds of years to shape. That was, the sword element is king, and the swordsmanship is only auxiliary. Once this common sense was broken, there would inevitably be some sword bearers who had no talent but were ambitious enough to think that they had someone like the commander. Even though he was only a famed sword-level sword-bearer, he was able to defeat a spirit sword-level sword-bearer. Practicing swordsmanship itself was not a bad thing. The bad thing was that these sword-bearers were blindly arrogant and wanted to fight Yuenko hand-to-hand, just like the swordmaster after mastering a lousy swordsmanship. In the end, they would die in vain in Yuenko's hands. This was not an alarmist matter. The Sword Committee had publicly announced 3 such incidents. The 3 idiots practiced, according to the video of the military governor, for a few days before going out of the city to practice swordsmanship with Yuenko. Then, 2 of them died tragically on the spot. The last one was returned by a passing patrol team and was so frightened that he became mentally weak and was receiving long-term psychological treatment. This was only one of the reasons. The more important reason was that the emotions of the ordinary people in the 8 base cities would be stirred up by the behavior of the military governor. Originally, after these ordinary people found that they could not synchronize with the Sword Lady, they could only accept the unequal treatment in the city and could only secretly envy the privileges that those sword wielders had. However, once they found out that they could obtain the same combat power as the sword wielders through another method, the whole society would definitely be in chaos. However, the Sword Committee reacted quickly. After discovering this sign, they immediately established the Sword Master Teaching class. They used the method of blocking the ordinary people's outburst of passion and made most of them realize that they were still ordinary people after all and did not have the talent to practice swordsmanship. At the same time, they could also discover those ordinary people who truly had the talent to practice swordsmanship and become the new generation of combat power. Although this matter had become a good thing, it could not be done too hastily. It had to be guided slowly and patiently. Once they all defeated the sword wielders of the immortal sword realm, the ordinary people's passion would definitely rise again, and the whole situation would really be difficult to control. In summary, this was the reason why Gahan believed that the Sword Committee would prohibit him from challenging the sword wielders of the immortal sword realm. After understanding this, Gahan no longer had any resentment towards the Sword Committee. After all, the Sword Committee was also considering the overall situation of mankind. At the same time, he was probably the first person in human history to be prohibited by the Sword Committee from challenging the sword wielders of the immortal sword realm. This was an unprecedented honor. Although Gahan understood the Sword Committee in the end, Gahan could not give up on training his swordsmanship. Since the way to challenge the sword wielders of the immortal sword realm was blocked, Gahan had to find a new way. After thinking about it, Gahan realized that this opponent was still in the Sword Lady Online, in the famed Sword-level Swordsman Instance Dungeon. Although all the main bosses in the famed Sword-level Swordsman Instance Dungeon could be defeated by famed Sword-level Swordsman Instance Dungeon, there were actually some story bosses and hidden bosses that swordsmen could not defeat. The simplest example was the King Arthur's Betrayal Instance Dungeon. In it, 3 of the 10 kings of the Martyr's Palace appeared. These 3 bosses were all universe-level Yuenko. At that time, the weak Gahan could only rely on all kinds of tricks. In the end, he was even forced to escape with a nuclear bomb. However, now that he was also a famed sword-level swordsman, Gahan could challenge this instance dungeon in a different way. System notification. Player military governor welcome to the King Arthur's Betrayal Instance Dungeon. Quest objective: find the imprisoned King Arthur and bring him back to Yanjing Bay City. System notification: main quest has been updated. Quest 1: search the battlefield. Your team has discovered a high-energy reaction nearby. It is suspected that there is a battle between Yuan Ko and the swordsman. Please find and arrive at the quest location within 10 minutes. If the quest is not completed within 10 minutes, the instance dungeon will fail. System notification: special notice. If you encounter a wandering Yuan Ko, please kill them immediately. Otherwise, they will issue a warning and attract all the Yuan Ko in the stronghold to attack you. Hearing these familiar system notifications, Gohan couldn't help but feel the urge to cry. He didn't think that he would be able to return to this instance dungeon after a few months. However, he was no longer the same person he was a few months ago. When he first entered this instance dungeon, he was only an ancient sword-level swordsman. Now, however, he had entered this instance dungeon as a famed sword-level swordsman. More importantly, his true strength had increased by more than 100 or even 1,000 times compared to before. Although Gohan had written an extremely detailed strategy on the forum to teach other players how to clear this instance dungeon, this strategy had also earned Gohan tens of millions of yuan. However, this time, Gohan didn't plan to clear this instance dungeon according to his strategy. He wanted to go crazy and use a method similar to a nuclear explosion to detonate the entire instance dungeon. Chapter 943. According to the strategy that Gohan provided to the players, they had to pass through T3 in order to reach parking lot P2 as quickly as possible. This was because Terminal T3 was filled with Flood Dragon-level Yuan bandits. If they relied on killing their way through Terminal T3, it would inevitably take a lot of time. Therefore, in the strategy, Gohan suggested that the players endure the damage from these Yuan Ko. As long as they rushed out of the range of T3, these Yuan Ko would not chase after them. This was indeed a very effective method. They all used this suggestion from the military governor to quickly pass through T3. However, this time, Gohan did not intend to pass through T3 according to the method described in the game strategy. He intended to use a more effective method. Gohan held the Juzi sword in his hand and injected 5,000 quarks of sword essence into it. An explosive aura surged out of Gohan's body and instantly filled the entire world. 9 swords of mysterious heaven. Waterfall golden chrysanthemum. With a single thought from Gohan's lips, the dazzling golden chrysanthemum, formed by more than 50 sword energies, instantly struck the entire T3 terminal. This T3 terminal, which had stood for 1,000 years, was cut into pieces by the sword energies like tofu. At the same time, the dozens of Yuan bandits in the T3 terminal were also directly cut into 2 pieces by the sword energies. Done. After releasing the waterfall golden chrysanthemum, the military governor walked into T3 with great ease. Along the way, he saw the dismembered corpses of Yuan Ko. These were all Yuan Ko who were equivalent to famed swordsmen. They were the opponents that Gohan could not fight back at all and could only face head-on. Now, with a single ultimate skill, all of these Yuan Ko were dead and could no longer stop Gohan's advance. The moment Gohan passed through T3, the T3 terminal, which had become dilapidated after 1,000 years, could no longer support its old body under the destructive attack of the waterfall golden chrysanthemum. The entire building collapsed as if it was facing a magnitude 12 earthquake and finally turned into a pile of dust. Gohan did not care about the fate of T3 terminal. He leisurely entered the parking lot of P2 and successfully found Shuda and Ardwolf, who were preparing to kill their opponents. "Who are you?" Gohan could ignore the collapse of T3 terminal, but Shuda could not pretend that he did not see it. He stared at Gohan, who was walking towards him with extreme vigilance. His hands tightly gripped the golden chisel spear in his hand, and the spearhead gave up on Ardwolf and pointed directly at Gohan's body. "Is it necessary? I just want this process to end as soon as possible." The Juzi sword in Gohan's hand trembled, and a beam of sword energy struck Shuda's body with lightning-like speed. You, Shuda did not even have the time to utter out the second word before his body broke apart like a broken vase. In the end, it became a pile of minced meat. The dragon-class Yuan Ko, whom Hong Yu and Heavenly Reliance had once needed to work together to quickly kill, was killed by one beam of sword energy. Hello, I am Ardwolf. You must have found this place through the message I left behind with the sword and the stone, right? I am very grateful to all of you for your assistance. Please accept my gratitude. Ardwolf stood up and thanked Gahan according to his script. Gahan had heard those words countless times since a few months ago. Goodbye. Ardwolf had yet to figure out why the person who came to save him would say goodbye to him. Did he not want to find out the next part of the quest from him? Next, Ardwolf's head was separated from his neck, and he became a corpse like Shuda. I am sorry. I did not want to waste time. Gahan looked at Ardwolf's corpse and said quietly. Gahan did not come to this instant's dungeon to reminisce with Ardwolf. He did not even want to see Artoria again. He had his own reasons for coming here. He did not want to waste time on the details of the instant's dungeon. At that moment, those details were meaningless to the current Gahan. Gahan only needed to be like a bulldozer as he bulldozed through this instant's dungeon. Arg! Arg! Countless screams rang out beside Gahan. The dragon-class Yuan Ko attacking Gahan were easily cut in half by Gahan's sword. He did not waste a second slash. The dragon-class Yuan Ko that once required the cooperation of 6 experts to kill were now as insignificant as ants on the ground. Other than being used to show off Gahan's strength, they had no other value. System notice. Quest 4. Clear the surface of Terminal T1 has been completed. Your party has successfully killed all the Yuan Ko and ensured that no messages were transmitted to the underground parking lot. Quest progress, 20%. Main quest updated. System notice. Quest 5. Underground Labyrinth. The underground parking lot of Terminal T1 has been turned into a labyrinth. Please pass through the labyrinth and arrive at the dimensional altar. Please pay attention to the time. Wasting too much time in the underground labyrinth may cause negative changes. System notice. Special notice. Please strictly abide by the rules of the underground labyrinth. Those who violate the rules will be severely punished. There were a total of 4 passageways that led to the dimensional altar in Terminal T1. The one that Gahan and his party had entered was the one where they had to take part in the college entrance exam, like the students before the apocalypse. Gahan had advised normal players to enter this passageway because the other passageways were blocked by the powerful Yuan Ko. It was not a passageway that ordinary famed swordsmen could clear. However, that was meaningless to Gahan. Gahan chose the passageway that was closest to him and entered the underground passageway. Human, how dare you disturb the slumber of the great Arthas? A knight riding on a tall horse appeared before Gahan. However, this horse wasn't an ordinary horse. Instead, it was a skeletal horse covered in steel armor forged from cold iron. The rider on this horse wasn't an ordinary human either. Instead, it was an undead whose skin was so pale that one could see the bones underneath. This was a Death Knight, an undead creature created by the powerful Lich King Yuan Ko. It had the freezing ability of Absolute Zero, the blood-sucking ability that surpassed vampires, and the undead summoning ability that was as terrifying as the Death Mages. In short, this was an extremely powerful Yuan Ko. The information on his personal terminal clearly showed that this Yuan Ko was at the meteor level. Killing such an opponent was undoubtedly an impossible task for a famed sword-level swordsman. This was the path closest to the dimensional altar. As long as he defeated the Death Knight and passed through the room where the Death Knight was, Gahan would be able to reach the dimensional altar directly. It was undoubtedly much simpler than the other 3 paths. However, this was also the most difficult path. In the eyes of 99% of the famed swordsmen, the meteor-level Yuan Ko was an existence that could not be defeated. Even if 6 famed swordsmen joined forces, it would still be impossible to defeat this meteor-level Yuan Ko. Gahan still vaguely remembered that there was such a passage in the dungeon information given to him by Yaoguan. The team led by Wondrous Pen had initially chosen this path to advance to the dimensional altar. Unfortunately, when the six top-notch famed swordsmen saw that their opponent was a Death Knight at the Meteor Realm, they could only smile wryly. After a difficult battle with the Death Knight, Arthas, for 30 minutes, the six famed swordsmen were directly sent out of the dungeon. Arthas still had 60% of his HP left. This completely put an end to the idea of Wondrous Pen and the others trying to pass through Arthas. In fact, in the following months, some famed sword-bearers who pursued unconventional achievements formed a team to attack Arthas. They constantly researched ways to defeat Arthas, and in the end, they succeeded in defeating Arthas. However, this team of famed swordsmen who defeated Arthas were the best among the famed swordsmen. At the same time, their composition was very unique. There were even some very unorthodox sword maidens who appeared specifically to deal with Arthas. These sword maidens were very weak when completing the other quests in the King Arthur's Betrayal Instance dungeon. Therefore, after defeating Arthas, this team of famed sword maidens were unable to clear the instance dungeon. However, this was not a problem for this team. Their original goal was to defeat Arthas. Whether or not they could clear the instance dungeon was not within their consideration. At this time, this powerful meteor-level Yuan Ko, who needed 6 famed swordsmen to defeat, was facing a challenge from a mere famed swordsman. A human? It's been a long time since I've smelled such nostalgia. I really miss the days when I was a human, even though those days made me feel so disgusted. Arthas rode on her skeletal warhorse and looked down at Gahan. Withered human, the merciful king has decided to grant you eternal life. Become a skeleton warrior under my command. Meteor-level Yuan Ko. I wonder how his combat power is compared to Jean's. Gahan did not care about what the Death Knight said at all. Instead, he looked at the Death Knight's body with great interest. He secretly estimated whether the Death Knight could become his opponent and help him improve his Chaos Sword technique. Return, my skeleton warrior. The Death Knight Arthas directly slashed at Gahan's neck. This sword attack was as fast as a bullet in the eyes of ordinary people, but in Gahan's eyes, it was like slow motion. Seems like you're not as good as Queen Jean. Gahan gently blocked with the juicy sword in his hand, skillfully pushing Arthas's giant sword to the other side. At the same time, his body flashed and appeared behind Arthas. At the same time, he slashed through the gap in Arthas's armor, leaving a deep wound on Arthas's body. Weak. Still too weak, Gahan said. Chapter 944. That's impossible. You're just a famed sword-grade swordsman. Although he was already dead, Arthas' eyes were still filled with disbelief. This powerful Death Knight had finally turned into a pile of broken bones and was absorbed by the dimensional vortex. It's not enough. It's still not enough. Looks like the fallen sword-grade Yuan Ko can no longer improve my swordsmanship. Gahan had a cold expression on his face. In the battle with Arthas, Gahan was like the other spirit sword-grade sword maidens. He did not use his sword essence from start to finish. Even so, Gahan only spent less than an hour and a half to kill Arthas. Arthas was not an ordinary Yuan Ko. He was a true fallen sword-grade Yuan Ko. Gahan could defeat his opponent without using sword essence. So if Gahan used sword essence, how much stronger would he be? What was even more terrifying was that Gahan's improvement had not reached its limit. The real limit would probably be when Gahan completely perfected his Chaos Sword technique. When that time came, Gahan would be looking forward to facing Gilgamesh again. Gahan wanted to return all the humiliation he had suffered to this opponent. Unfortunately, Gilgamesh was already dead. System notification, Quest 5, Underground Labyrinth completed. Your party has arrived at the Dimensional Altar. Quest progress 40%. Main quest updated. System notification. Quest 6. Save King Arthur. King Arthur Artoria Pendragon has been bound by magic. Please break the magic binding and save the controlled King Arthur. Gahan couldn't help but let out a sigh when he saw King Arthur Artoria Pendragon, who was wearing a snow-white wedding gown and had a seductive butt. He walked towards the Dimensional Altar. I wonder if everyone still remembers that this dimensional altar is actually a very dangerous trap. The surroundings of the dimensional altar were filled with dimensional turbulence. No matter who it was, once they touched these dimensional turbulence, they would be torn to pieces in an instant. Even a spirit sword grade swordsman was no exception, let alone a famed sword grade swordsman. Even if Gohan's strength had increased by a terrifying amount, it was only in terms of swordsmanship. In terms of physical fitness, Guhan's physical fitness was still that of an ordinary famed sword-grade swordsman. The Juzi sword protective shield was still that of a famed sword-grade swordsman. Steel's centipede, who had hundreds of thousands of cork sword essence and had top-notch defensive abilities and skills, only had 4% of its protective shield energy left in the face of the dimensional turbulence. Although the Juzi sword's defensive ratio far exceeded Steel Bong's by 2 times, the sword essence in Guhan's body was less than a third of Steel Bong's. In other words, the defensive ability of Guhan's Juzi sword's close-fitting shield was simply not comparable to Steel Bang's. If Guhan chose to face the dimensional turbulence head-on, Guhan would probably die on the spot with the Juzi sword's ability. Of course, if Guhan was willing to use the starting point sword, it would be a different story. But for some reason, the game did not scan the starting point sword's ability to use the upper limit of sword essence as a protective shield energy. Therefore, the starting point sword's performance here might not be as practical as the Juzi sword. In this case, it seemed that Guhan could only follow the method written in his guide to remove the dimensional turbulence of the dimensional altar. According to the method described in Guhan's guide, 5 people needed to cooperate from different directions to remove the magic runes on the arena and make the dimensional turbulence disappear. However, Guhan was alone now. It was impossible for him to gather 5 people. Even if he could gather 5 people, Guhan did not want to use such a complicated method. Guhan stepped onto the dimensional altar without hesitation. He did not even look at the magic runes on the altar as he casually stepped on it. 4 spatial turbulence instantly appeared beside Guhan, preparing to slash at Guhan's body. However, Guhan did not panic. He tapped the Juzi sword a few times in the air, and the spatial turbulence that had been aimed at Guhan seemed to be disrupted by something. The 4 turbulence collided at the same time, and the powerful energy collision instantly triggered a riot in the entire dimensional altar. All the dimensional turbulence exploded like a bomb. Boom! A loud sound rang out. The entire dimensional altar was razed to the ground by the explosion of the dimensional turbulence. The entire altar disappeared, and a deep pit the size of half a basketball court appeared in the ground. However, although the altar had disappeared, the person on the altar was safe and sound. Guhan had appeared in the safe zone of the temple at some point in time, carrying the unconscious Artoria in his arms. Amazing! Amazing! You were actually able to use your sword chi to shake the entire space and affect the path of the dimensional turbulence, ultimately detonating everything. Your swordsmanship is truly terrifying. It's no wonder that Arthas, who was at the door, died under your sword. Furthermore, you were able to rescue Artoria and bring her to a safe place within a single second of the dimensional turbulence's impact. I'm afraid that your Excellency's movement technique is one of the rarest in the human world. It's really hard to imagine how such a powerful famed swordsman like your Excellency was born. In my life, I'm afraid I've only seen 2 human swordsmen reach such a terrifying level. One had red lips, white teeth, and a pale face, but was extraordinarily handsome. The one wearing a pointy wizard hat and a black wizard robe stood in front of Guhan in admiration. This was naturally Artoria's teacher, the meteor-level Grand Mage Yuan Ko Merlin, whom Guhan still couldn't figure out which side he was on. Do you want to fight me? Guhan squinted at Grand Mage Merlin. I don't dare. Grand Mage Merlin waved his hands. What a joke. Even Arthas was defeated by him. Wouldn't he be courting death if he went over? Then I'm leaving. Guhan raised the Juzi sword in his hand and used chaos splits the heavens. A rainbow-like sword chi shot into the sky, creating a huge hole in the ceiling of the divine hall. Then, Guhan directly jumped out of the hole. Boom, boom, boom. My dear elf goddess, Why is the script so messed up this time? With such a terrifying guy interfering, will there be any unforeseen events? Grand Mage Merlin couldn't help but shiver when he saw the large hole in the ceiling. This underground temple was built using ancient technology. Even universe-level Yuan Ko would have to spend a lot of effort to break through the ceiling. This human was only a famed swordsman, but his sword energy could actually break through the entire ceiling. This kind of strength was no different from the 10 kings of the Martyr's Palace. Will Hitler and the others fail miserably? Grand Mage Merlin muttered to himself. At this moment, he realized that the entire situation seemed to be completely out of his control. I didn't expect Chaos Flying Immortal to have such a terrifying power when combined with sword essence. I'm afraid the power of that sword just now has already surpassed the power of 9 swords of mysterious heaven, sword battling heaven, at the same level of sword essence. Gahan himself was also surprised by the power of that sword. 9 swords of mysterious heaven, sword battling heaven, was the move with the most terrifying single target damage in the 9 swords of mysterious heaven, sword battling heaven. It allowed Gahan to burst out with more than 10 times the damage. It was equivalent to Gahan's trump card. However, when Gahan used the newly created Chaos Flying Immortal for the first time with 10,000 quarks of sword essence, the power that burst out shocked Gahan. This was because the power of this sword was also more than 10 times the damage that 9 swords of mysterious heaven, sword battling heaven, could cause with 10,000 quarks of sword essence. Adding the two together, Gahan could burst out with a sword that was 100 times more powerful than a normal move. With this move, Chaos Flying Immortal, Gahan could almost declare that he was already invincible among sword bearers at the spiritual sword level when he used sword essence. This was only in the game, and Gahan only had 70 to 80,000 quarks of sword essence. If it was in reality with Gahan's more than 400,000 quarks of sword essence, even if it was a sword bearer at the immortal sword level, if the other party did not use the Gate of the Void, perhaps only the top few would be able to fight with Gahan head-on. I didn't expect just Chaos Flying Immortal to be this terrifying. If I complete all the remaining 4 moves of Chaos Sword Technique, then my Chaos Sword Technique will probably become a sword technique comparable to the Billion Sword Technique and the Yin Yang Sword Technique ! Gahan thought silently in his heart. In fact, when he developed Chaos Splitting the Heavens, Gahan did not know how many moves the final product of Chaos Sword Technique would have. However, at this moment, a sudden realization surged in Gahan's heart. That was, when Gahan completely completed the Chaos Sword Technique, there should be a total of 7 moves in the Chaos Sword Technique. At this time, Gahan had already created Chaos Splitting the Heavens, Chaos Stars, and Chaos Flying Immortal. These 3 sword moves were Chaos Splitting the Heavens, Chaos Stars, and Chaos Flying Immortal. He was still 4 moves away from completing the Chaos Sword Technique. Just creating the previous 3 moves had already cost Gahan a lot of time and energy. It had also allowed Gahan to achieve the terrifying achievement of being invincible below the spiritual sword level just by relying on his sword technique. According to these conditions, Gahan would probably need to defeat an Emperor Sword level sword bearer in order to completely create the entire Chaos Sword Technique. Defeating an Emperor Sword level sword bearer with just sword technique. Gahan could not help but stare at the juicy sword in his hand and silently asked himself, is this really something that a human can do? Chapter 945. Under the suppression of absolute strength. After nearly half a year, this King Arthur's betrayal instance dungeon, which had forced Gahan to rack his brains, discover all the subtle clues, and use all possible means to complete it, had now become a toy in the hands of a baby in Gahan's eyes. He could easily crush the entire instance dungeon with 1 foot. The only thing that could make Gahan look forward to it was the opponents that would appear next. According to the dungeon strategy, Gahan should escape at full speed with Artoria and try his best to avoid the 3 universe-level Yuan Ko's pursuit. He absolutely couldn't let the universe-level Yuan Ko catch up to him, or else Gahan would die. Well, that was a matter of a few months ago. For the current Gahan, the only thing he was looking forward to was the 3 universe-level Yuankos that were about to arrive. Yes, this was the main reason why Gahan returned to the King Arthur's Betrayal Instance Dungeon. He didn't want to continue his relationship with Artoria, who was in the Instance Dungeon. Gohan's real goal was the 3 universe-level Yuankos that were chasing him, and they would become Gohan's best training targets. After the Spirit Sword level sword-bearers couldn't help Gahan improve his swordsmanship, Gahan could only place his hope on these universe-level Yuankos to train himself. Therefore, after Gahan rescued Artoria, he didn't run far. Instead, he came to an empty ruin, put Artoria's body on his lap, and silently waited for the universe-level Yuanko's arrival. At this moment, Artoria's snow-white skin and the simple and elegant wedding dress made her look so charming that Gahan couldn't help but have an impulse. Before entering this instance dungeon, Gahan had a clear goal of completing the dungeon's mission. Plus, he had been fleeing passionately along the way, so Gahan didn't have much time to care about Artoria's beautiful body. Even if he had to take off Artoria's wedding dress for some reason and completely see Artoria's graceful naked body, Gahan didn't have the mood to care about other inexplicable things. But now it was different. Now Gahan had completely given up on completing the mission, and the nearest Nazi king, Hitler, would need at least an hour to rush over. This way, Gahan could quietly accompany the unconscious Artoria for a full hour without any pressure. This hour was enough for Gahan to let his imagination run wild. As for whether or not Gahan did anything to Artoria in this hour, we can discuss this in the future and won't talk about it here. Scum, why didn't you escape? Are you looking down on the Great Reich Chancellor? Seeing the long-awaited appearance of the Third Reich of Germany, Gahan knew that he had watched Artoria fight while his opponent was Hitler, one of the 10 kings of the Valhalla, the Nazi king. Let's fight. Gahan shrugged his shoulders, then straightened his clothes that had slipped a little. He looked at the Third Reich with great interest and said, Hitler's combat power was not that great, but the Third Reich's combat power was amazing, especially its defensive ability. It was unknown what kind of metal the surface of the Third Reich was made of. Without using sword essence, Gahan could only leave a few shallow marks on the surface of the Third Reich's body with his own sword skills. This was like a naughty child taking a key and drawing marks on a shiny car. Although it looked quite annoying, and the 4S shop would often charge a few $1,000s for damage. But in fact, these marks were nothing to a car and could not affect the performance of the car at all. It was just ugly. The damage that Gahan caused to the Third Reich was probably similar to the scratches on the surface of the car. Although it looked quite powerful, it was actually useless. This was also the limitation of Gahan's pure sword skills. That was, when facing an opponent with extremely strong defense, and who could defend from all angles, no matter how good one's swordsmanship was, it would be useless because Solid Cold could not attack the opponent's effective parts. Of course, if Gahan used Sword Essence, the result would be completely different. With the blessing of Sword Essence, Gahan was confident that he could open a hole in the armor of the Third Reich, and as long as there was a hole that could allow Gahan to enter the armor of the Third Reich, Gahan was confident that he could kill Hitler. After all, no matter how strong a fortress was, it could not withstand damage from the inside. Of course, the Third Reich also could not cause fatal damage to Gahan. This was because Gahan's movement was too flexible, and the Third Reich's attacks were very stiff and rigid. For Gahan, it was a piece of cake to avoid such attacks. However, when the Law Hammurabi also arrived, Gahan's battle came to an end. Facing the attacks of 2 universe-level Yuan-Ko at the same time, Gahan was as fragile as a seagull in a storm. He was easily thrown into the deep sea and was doomed eternally. Then, he was forced to quit the game because he failed the mission. For the next month, Gahan was completely immersed in the King Arthur's Betrayal dungeon. On average, Gahan entered the dungeon more than 10 times a day, which meant that he had to fight more than 10 times with Hitler's Third Reich. In 1 month, that was more than 300 battles, and more than 300 battles were lost. It was different from the previous battles with the Spirit Sword-level swordsman. In the battles with the Spirit Sword-level swordsman, Gahan's longest battle was 9 consecutive defeats. Finally, he won the 10th time and defeated the spirit sword-level swordsman. However, after more than 300 battles, not to mention consecutive victories, Gahan didn't even see any progress. This was because Gahan couldn't penetrate the armor of the Third Reich without using the sword element, which meant that Gahan couldn't cause any substantial damage to Hitler. Of course, in this month, Gahan wasn't without results. At least, Gahan's control of his power had improved a lot. Before, the damage that Gahan caused to the Third Reich was like a child holding a key and scratching the paint of a flower car. Now, the damage that Gahan caused to the Third Reich was like an adult holding a pair of sharp scissors. If Gahan's damage to the Third Reich could increase at this rate, then Gahan probably wouldn't be able to penetrate the armor of the Third Reich after 100 years. But even a fool knew that this actually didn't have any meaning, because with the physical fitness of a famous sword-level swordsman, such damage would eventually reach a limit that could no longer be advanced. Even if such a limit didn't exist, Gahan didn't have 100 years to waste in this dungeon. So it stood to reason that after a month of failure, Gahan should give up this stupid thing. Either he should give up and fight with a slightly lower defense Yuan Ko, who could break the defense of Gahan, or Gahan should simply change his way of improving his swordsmanship. Anyway, he couldn't fight to the death with the Third Reich like a fool. Don't believe in idioms like how water dripping wears through a stone and an iron pestle grinds a needle. It would take 10,000 years for a drop of water to wear away a stone, and the story of grinding a needle with an iron pestle was a complete joke. This was just a story written by an otaku in the Song Dynasty. The credibility of this story was as nonsensical as the novels XX Firmament, XX World, and Sword Maiden, written by those web novelists at home. But unexpectedly, Gahan kept persevering. Even if the ending was the same every time, Gahan still persisted. But this wasn't because Gahan was stupid, and it wasn't because Gahan believed in idioms like how an iron pestle grinds a needle and water dripping wears through a stone. It was because Gahan had a vague feeling that the next move of his chaos sword technique was hidden on the Third Reich. As long as Gahan could find a way to break the turtle shell of the Third Reich, then Gahan would be able to learn the fourth move of the chaos sword technique. Trial by law. You are guilty and deserve to be cut into pieces. Countless swords appeared around Gahan, but these swords didn't seem to have a physical body and were just illusory existences. But these illusory swords made it impossible for Gahan to dodge, because these swords didn't attack Gahan in a physical sense. They were just floating in the air, and Gahan felt a pain from the depths of his body, as if countless swords were cutting into him. His body shield didn't suffer any damage, and he didn't lose any energy, but Gahan's body directly collapsed, turning into minced meat and disappearing from this world. This was how Gahan died for the past month. It was as miserable as a fat pig being cut into pieces. After dying in such a miserable way one day, Gahan was ready to make another effort to challenge Hitler in the game. A group push news caught Gahan's attention. It was a piece of historical and cultural news. It was about a team of swordsmen from Yinjing City who found a book with only a few pages left in the ruins of the ancient city of Qinzhou. The name of the book was already untraceable, and even the content of the book was difficult to analyze from these few pages. Therefore, the Society of Historical and Cultural Research simply took photos of the remaining pages and sent them to all the members of the Society of Historical and Cultural Research, hoping that they could brainstorm and analyze what the book was talking about. Gahan curiously flipped through these few pages. This page seemed to be about a teacher teaching her students. What impressed Gahan the most was that the female teacher was teaching her students what was internal force and how to practice internal force. What is internal force? When a person moves, every movement produces energy and heat, and this energy and heat contains internal force. When a person's pores are closed, sweat can't flow out, and heat can't evaporate. When a person moves vigorously, the blood and energy in their body will turn into this heat, and the energy and sweat will be released through the pores. This is the principle of training energy into internal force, which is also internal force. Whether one can hold this internal force or not is the standard of whether one has internal force or not. Internal force can also be trained in the whole body. In the eyes of the Guhan, the logic contained in these words was as unreasonable as a fart. However, what made the Guhan feel extremely uncomfortable was that these words continued to linger in the Guhan's mind. This sentence was like a fishbone stuck in Guhan's mind, making it impossible for Guhan to sleep well. It made Guhan think about this sentence for 3 days and 3 nights. Guhan could feel that this sentence seemed to be hiding some great path of swordsmanship, but Guhan still couldn't figure out what this great path was and how it should be reflected in his swordsmanship. Chapter 946. On a certain day, Guhan launched the 312th battle against the German Third Reich in more than a month. Of course, this time, Guhan still failed. By the time Emarabi appeared, Guhan had already been cut into pieces by 1,000 blades. If someone could carefully use nano-level high-precision equipment to analyze the traces of this battle, then this person might find that this time, the marks caused by Guhan on the metal armor of the German Third Reich were not deeper than the last 311th battle, but correspondingly weaker. It was just that the weakening was so small that it could only be detected on a nano-level scale. In the 323rd battle, the marks caused by this battle were compared to the marks caused by the 311th battle. It could already be seen with the naked eye that the marks caused by this battle had decreased. In the 356th battle, the marks caused by the sharp scissors in the hands of an adult had changed back to the marks caused by the key in the hands of a child. In the 383rd battle, the marks of the battle seemed to have become faint. Unless one held a magnifying glass in their hands, it was impossible to see the marks caused by the battle. In the 499th battle, it was now necessary to use nano-level high-precision equipment again. It was just that previously it was to check the extent of the changes in the marks, but this time it was to check whether there were any marks on the surface of the German Third Reich, because the marks caused by Guhan could no longer be seen with the naked eye. However, Guhan seemed to be stuck here. In the next 100 battles, Guhan was unable to improve this result. Guhan felt that there was a thin layer of window paper in front of him. As long as he could pierce through this layer of window paper, Guhan could achieve his goal. But this thin layer of window paper seemed to be like cowhide, and Guhan was unable to pierce through it. Watching the days go by, Guhan's calm temper began to gradually become anxious. Anyone who had failed 600 times in an experiment would have developed this kind of anxiety. Don't tell me that Edison had experimented with more than 10,000 materials to make light bulbs. At that time, Edison was already the rich boss of the General Electric Company. These more than 10,000 experiments were not conducted by Edison alone, but by hundreds of experimenters in more than a dozen laboratories under Edison's command, including the future father of alternating current power transmission, Nikola Tesla. As for Edison himself, at most, he would go around the laboratory once a day, give the hard-working experimenters some cheap encouragement, and then openly claim the experimental results as his own. Of course, from a legal point of view, these experimental results and patents should naturally belong to Edison. After all, Edison was the one who paid these experimenters to do experiments. But Edison shamelessly took all the credit for these results. He didn't mention the names of these poor experimenters in any news reports. Even the signatures at the end of the paper didn't give these experimenters who had worked hard for several years chance. It was no wonder that Nikola Tesla left General Electric and became lifelong enemies with Edison. P.S. Edison was actually a very despicable guy. He was far from the king of inventions in the media. In fact, 70% to 80% of the patents he invented in his life were invented by the experimenters under him, and Edison shamelessly took all these titles for himself. Of course, it was undeniable that Edison's invention and scientific research abilities were indeed the best. Just as Guhan was about to be tortured by the 600th failure, another opportunity appeared in front of Guhan. This opportunity did not come from a novel before the apocalypse like the last time, but from the two fellows under Guhan who were the most troublesome, Qingpin and Etion. In fact, this time, Etion was unjustly implicated. After the 599th failure, Guhan decided to take a day off to recover his physical strength. More importantly, He wanted to adjust his mentality and find a way to find the source of the problem. But it was also at this time that Gahan suddenly saw a scene that he did not know how to ridicule. Etion took advantage of the break to drink over 100 bottles of wine. Then, drunk, she fell asleep on the bed. At this time, the gluttonous Qingpin actually took advantage of the opportunity when Gahan was not paying attention to secretly hold the bottles of wine that Etion left on the ground and gulped down a few bottles of wine. His little face instantly became red, and then he began to walk drunkenly. Not only did he walk, but Qingpin also climbed onto Etion's bed unsteadily. Then he bit Etion's arm. Perhaps he felt that the arm didn't taste good, so he bit Etion's neck. Perhaps he still felt that Etion's neck wasn't easy to bite. In short, Qingpin almost bit Etion's body all over, and in a daze, he finally bit Etion's foot. Good heavens, it directly ate Etion's toe in one bite. Then, in an instant, Qingpin's eyes bulged, and he spat out his foot. He bit Etion twice, and his big cute eyes blurred as he began to cry. While crying, he shouted, so stinky, so disgusting." Qingpin did not think that Etion was the most restless among Gahan's sword maidens. As long as he had free time, he would wander around everywhere, running at least 10 kilometers every day. Of course, his feet were filled with the smell of a beauty. Perhaps because he felt that crying alone was not enough to vent his anger, Qingpin decided to take revenge on Etion. However, no one knew what was in her poor head. She actually stepped on the Heavenly Reliance's pair of towering, mountain-like European pies and started jumping up and down. Yes, that's right. Qingpin probably treated Etion's opium pies as two springs. He stepped on them and began to jump crazily. Not to mention, the elasticity of these two springs was really not bad. It actually allowed Qingpin to jump 4 or 5 meters high. Even the standing high jump of the Olympic Games might not be able to achieve such a result. Qingpin jumped for dozens of minutes, and the huge movement even alerted Gahan. But when Gahan saw this scene, his attention was not on Qingpin, who deserved a spanking, but on Etion, who was still sleeping soundly under Qingpin's feet. Even if there was the effect of alcohol, ordinary people should have woken up long ago after being tortured like this. How could Etion still sleep so soundly as if nothing had happened? Thinking of this, Gahan did not stop Qingpin's terrible behavior. Instead, he became a focused spectator, carefully watching Qingpin's jump in his head, especially the moment when Qingpin's feet came into contact with Etion's opium pies. Etion's opium pies underwent a wonderful transformation, and, at the same time, it produced an upward elasticity, pushing Qingpin's body up again. This was such a wonderful process that Gahan didn't feel tired even after watching it hundreds of times. On the other hand, Qingpin was a little tired from jumping. He was sweating profusely and was ready to give up on taking revenge on Etion. "Wait," Gahan called out to Qingpin. "Continue jumping. Don't stop unless I tell you to." Things were often like this in the world. The same thing, if you took the initiative to do it, then you would feel that it was very enjoyable. However, if someone forced you to do it, then you would feel that it was the most painful thing in the world. To Qingpin, the current situation was more or less like this. No matter how happy she was jumping on Etion's opium pies, when it became Gahan's mandatory order, Qingpin couldn't be happy no matter what. Although she was still jumping, the expression on her face was as bitter as if her sword wielder had died. If she continued to jump, we didn't doubt that Qingpin would really start crying. Fortunately, after a short while, Gahan suddenly slapped his head and instantly went back into the game. He didn't even have time to bring these sword ladies into the game. However, Gahan didn't need to bring them in, because to Gahan, it was enough to have their sword ladies in the game. After quickly completing all the foreplay, Gahan also saw the Third Reich for the 600th time. However, this time, Gahan was already prepared. It was still the same fighting style as before. Gahan's sword attacked the surface of the Third Reich's armor. However, it was different from before. Although Gahan's sword kept colliding with the Third Reich, the surface of the Third Reich's armor didn't even have a trace of damage. Even with nano-level detection equipment, it wasn't able to detect a trace of damage. This was almost impossible, because even if an ant crawled across the surface of the Third Reich, nano-level detection equipment would be able to detect traces of the ant's path. However, when Gahan's sword collided with it, nothing was left. Gahan didn't hide his strength. On the contrary, when Gahan attacked, the muscles on his entire arm bulged. It was obvious that he had poured all his strength into the sword in his hand. 1 sword, 2 swords, 3 swords, 9 swords. In a flash, Gahan slashed a total of 9 swords on the Third Reich. If the trajectories of these 9 swords were all connected, then one would be surprised to find that Gahan had drawn a lotus pattern on the surface of the Third Reich. As soon as the lotus was drawn, Gahan fell from the Third Reich as if he had exhausted all his strength. He fell heavily on the ground and didn't even have the strength to move his fingers, let alone get up from the ground. Trash! Is that all you have? You're not even as good as a woman. Hitler's laughter came from the Third Reich through the loudspeakers. At this time, only less than 20 seconds had passed since the start of the battle. In 20 seconds, Gahan fell to the ground like a dead dog. In Hitler's eyes, this guy was indeed not even as good as a woman. Trash! Let the Führer. The Third Reich raised the particle cannon in its hand. As long as the cannon grazed the edge of Gahan's skin, Gahan's body would disintegrate in an instant and turn into a pile of the purest particles in the world. Fire! 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 Hitler kept pressing the firing button in the control room, but there was no response from the Third Reich. Trash! This machine crashed again. Hitler thought that the Third Reich had suddenly crashed. This was not an abnormal thing. No matter how powerful a computer was, it would still crash when it needed to. But it didn't matter if it crashed, as long as it was restarted. Hitler thought so too. When he pressed the restart button, the entire German Third Reich suddenly let out a loud roar. Then, the interior of the German Third Reich seemed to have lost all support. It collapsed to the ground like an inverted pyramid, completely turning into a pile of waste. This move I'll call you Chaos Golden Lotus. Gahan, who was lying on the ground, looked at the scene in front of him with satisfaction and gave the 4th move of Chaos Swordsmanship such a name. Chapter 9, 47. Chaotic Golden Lotus was the 4th move in the Chaos Sword technique that Gahan had created. It was also the most insidious move in the Chaos Sword technique. It was a move that Gahan had created by combining the hidden force recorded in the novel from before the apocalypse, as well as the soft force that Gahan had comprehended from watching Chink Bin jumping around the heavens Europa sect. When this chaotic Golden Lotus was practiced to the highest level, even if one used all their strength to slash at the opponent's body, not a single hair on the opponent's skin would be harmed. However, in reality, the force that was like a golden lotus would penetrate the opponent's skin and enter the opponent's body. On the surface, it would look fine, but the force had already entered the opponent's body. One could imagine how terrifying it would be once a powerful force entered one's internal organs. Even if one had the defensive ability of the World Emperor alloy, once this sharp force entered one's body, there was no doubt that only death awaited them. This was why the marks that Gahan left on the surface of the German Third Reich were getting shallower and shallower. As the marks got shallower and shallower, more and more sword chi entered the opponent's body. When there were no longer any marks left on the surface of the body, as if it had not been touched at all, it meant that all of the sword chi had entered the opponent's body. At the same time, the damage of the chaotic Golden Lotus was stacked with the NTH power. For example, if the chaotic Golden Lotus was used continuously, the first strike could cause 100 points of damage in the opponent's body, then the second strike could cause 200 points of damage, and the third strike could cause 400 points of damage. When Gahan had killed Hitler, he had stacked 9 strikes, which was equivalent to causing 200,000 points of damage in the interior of the German Third Reich. Gahan had deliberately vented this damage on the German Third Reich's power core. This attack had directly caused the power core of the German Third Reich to explode, instantly destroying the internal parts of the German Third Reich. However, this also proved how terrifying the defense of the German Third Reich's armor was. Even if there was an explosion inside the Third Reich, its external armor was still intact. It was like a firecracker. You ignited the gunpowder hidden inside the firecracker, but the circle of red paper wrapped around the firecracker did not move at all. In a sense, it was indeed a squib. However, 9 strikes wasn't the limit of the Chaos Golden Lotus. In theory, the Chaos Golden Lotus could stack countless strikes. In fact, when Gahan could stack up to 20 strikes, the 20th strike would be able to deal 1,048,576,000 damage, which was more than 100 million damage. Moreover, this was only the damage Gahan dealt when he didn't use Sword Essence. Once Gohan used Sword Essence in tandem with Sword Essence and activated his Sword Energy, the damage he dealt would be at least tenfold, reaching a frightening 1 billion damage. This was not an injury that any existence could withstand. Even if it was an expert whose ability surpassed an Emperor Sword level sword wielder, when his body suffered such a strong injury, he would probably die immediately. There would definitely be no accidents. However, whether Gahan could successfully use the 10th strike was also a big question mark, let alone the 20th strike. Just like the terrifying stacking damage of the Chaos Golden Lotus, the Chaos Golden Lotus required a similarly terrifying amount of stamina and energy. For example, after Gahan used the Chaos Golden Lotus 9 strikes, he could only lie on the ground like a dead dog. This was because Gahan had exhausted all of his stamina and energy. For Gahan, if he wanted to break through the limit of the Chaos Golden Lotus 9 strikes and use the 10th strike, he would have to at least wait for Gahan to synchronize with a Spirit Sword level sword lady. If this video of the battle were to be released, the whole world would probably go crazy over Gahan's results again. A famed sword level sword wielder could actually defeat the Third German Reich, which was equivalent to a fairy sword level sword wielder, without using Sword Element. If Gahan used Sword Element, wouldn't he be able to go against the natural order and directly defeat an Emperor Sword level sword wielder? Needless to say, the crown of the number 1 sword wielder in history would pass from Kenzu's head to Gahan's head. Gahan would also officially become the number 1 sword wielder. However, Gahan knew in his heart that this was pure bullsh*t. Even though Gahan had indeed defeated the U-level Yuan Ko Nazi King Hitler, this did not mean that Gahan truly had the ability to defeat the U-level Yuan Ko. On the contrary, this was completely due to Gahan's luck. First of all, Gahan's opponent was the Nazi King Hitler, a special U-level Yuan Ko. Hitler was probably the one with the highest attack and defense among all the U-level Yuan Ko. However, the Third German Reich's agility was really terrible. No matter how strong the Third German Reich's attack was, it could not defeat the agile Gahan. At the same time, the Third German Reich's weakness was very obvious. Its power core itself was too weak. Usually, the power core was very safe under the protection of the hard external armor, so it could not become the Third German Reich's weakness. However, when the Third German Reich's proud defense was no longer there, this fatal weakness was completely exposed. Otherwise, how could a mere 200,000 damage kill the U-level Yuan Ko with tens of millions of HP? In fact, Hitler had basically died from his own suicide. This was very similar to his original ending. Another important point was that Hitler had severely underestimated his enemy. Every U-level Yuan Ko had the ability to enter the void. Although the Third German Reich didn't have the ability to enter the void, the problem was that Hitler himself could. As long as Hitler himself hid in the void, the moment the Third German Reich exploded, he would be able to escape unscathed. After a while, the Third German Reich would automatically repair itself, and Hitler would be a good man again. Unfortunately, Hitler didn't expect that a human who couldn't even leave a mark on the Third German Reich's armor could actually detonate the Third German Reich's power core. Hitler didn't know that the power core of the Third German Reich had exploded until the moment he died. Hitler died without knowing why. Therefore, when Gahan encountered other U-level Yuan Ko, it was still unrealistic to defeat the opponent without using Sword Essence. First of all, 200,000 damage couldn't cause fatal damage to most U-level Yuan Ko. Not every U-level Yuan Ko was like Hitler and had a power core that could kill him. More importantly, the opponent only needed to hide in the void. Then, before Gahan also had the ability to enter the void, Gahan couldn't do anything to these U-level Yuan Ko. In summary, Gahan didn't plan to announce his achievements. Otherwise, if other people suggested that Gahan kill another U-level Yuan Ko and Gahan couldn't, it would be very embarrassing. For Gahan, being able to create the fourth move of the Chaos Sword Art, Chaos Golden Lotus, was Gahan's biggest reward. This meant that Gahan was one step closer to the peak of sword art. However, what Gahan didn't expect was that after Gahan killed Hitler, the system suddenly sent a series of notifications. System notification: you have killed the Nazi King Hitler and activated the King Arthur's Betrayal dungeon's hidden Easter egg. You have successfully activated the hidden 12 skyscraping temples dungeon. System notification: the hidden Easter egg has been activated. King Arthur's Betrayal dungeon is about to close. Please leave the dungeon or be forcefully kicked out after 30 seconds. System notification: the hidden Easter egg has been activated. King Arthur's Betrayal dungeon will forever seal player military governor. Player military governor can no longer enter King Arthur's Betrayal dungeon. Just as the system prompt stated, when Gahan left the instance dungeon and opened up the instance dungeon tree to search for King Arthur's Betrayal again, he discovered that the instance dungeon's name had disappeared from its original position. In its place was a dungeon called 12 Skyscraping Temples. What a pity. I won't be able to see Artoria again. Seeing that, Gahan could not help but feel regret. As such, before the next instance dungeon related to Artoria was opened, Gahan would forever lose the chance to see Artoria again. In the entire game world's 200 years, only one instance dungeon related to Artoria had been opened. Who knew when the next instance dungeon would open? 10 years, 20 years, or 120 years? Or could it be 1,200 years? Well, the happiness in the game was only temporary and illusory. Gahan's ultimate goal was to find traces of Artoria in the real world. According to the various clues, Artoria should be trapped in a desperate situation, waiting for Gahan's rescue. However, as the saying goes, what you lose on the swings, you gain on the mulberry. When the King Arthur's Betrayal dungeon closed to Gahan, a brand new 12 Skyscraping Temples dungeon appeared before Gahan. What kind of dungeon was this hidden dungeon? The hidden dungeon in Sword Maiden Online had always had one meaning, and that was similar to the King Arthur's Betrayal dungeon. After the dungeon was cleared for the first time, the entire dungeon would be open to all players. However, such a hidden dungeon would usually only appear in July or August of the second year. It was only February now, and the timing did not match up at all. Gina-chan, what does this dungeon mean? If there was anything in the game that he did not understand, he could ask Tomono Kakaze. Therefore, Gahan directly contacted Tomono Kakaze and told Tomono Kakaze everything that he had encountered. What? You killed the universe level Yuan Ko with the ability of a famed sword-level player? You scared me to death, Tomono Kakaze said as she patted her small chest. However, she did not look that surprised. This was because Tomono Kakaze did not know that Gahan had killed the universe level Yuan Ko without using sword essence. Otherwise, Tomono Kakaze's artificial intelligence core might have a logical breakdown. That's not the point. The point is this 12 Skyscraping Temples dungeon. What is going on with this dungeon? Can I go in? Gahan straightforwardly asked the question in his heart. 12 Skyscraping Temples? Isn't this an abandoned dungeon? Tomono Kakaze said in shock. Chapter 948. The 12 Heavenly Temples was probably the most memorable abandoned dungeon in Tomono Kakaze's memory. The so-called abandoned instance dungeons were those that had already been designed and completed, but in the end, they were abandoned by the developers. There were many such abandoned dungeons in Sword Maiden Online. It was said that 108 dungeons were designed and created when the game was first launched. However, only 98 of them were used while the remaining 10 were abandoned. Apart from that, the game would add a new dungeon every year. Of course, these dungeons were created after thorough discussions and confirmed that there were no problems. However, there were always some special circumstances that happened in the past 200 years. As a result, these dungeons had to be abandoned after they were completed and would never appear in front of the players again. There were many reasons for this. Some of them were because the dungeon story was found to be inconsistent with reality and was forced to be abandoned. Some of them were because the plot of the dungeon caused dissatisfaction with the family members of the characters involved in the dungeon and was forced to be abandoned. There were also problems with the difficulty of the dungeon that made it difficult for the players to complete the dungeon and was forced to be abandoned. However, the most common reason was that the dungeon could not pass the review of the Sword Committee after it was created. The 12 Heavenly Palaces was such an instance dungeon. In fact, the 12 Heavenly Palaces was one of the oldest instance dungeons in Sword Maiden Online. It was one of the 10 instance dungeons that were abandoned when Sword Maiden Online was first launched. It was said that some beta players were lucky enough to play this instance dungeon. In the game's official website, there was also information about the 12 Heavenly Palaces. However, when the game started its open beta, the dungeon was completely removed. Later on, there was some news that the dungeon did not pass the review of the Sword Committee. As for the reason, no one could figure it out because the Sword Committee was too lazy to explain such things. Therefore, when Tomono Kakaze heard that Gahan had unlocked the 12 Heavenly Temples dungeon, her childish face instantly turned sour. She did not even bother to say another word to Gahan. She closed her eyes and began to search for the dungeon. The search went on for a full hour. Finally, he opened his eyes helplessly and said to Gahan, "Don't enter this dungeon for now. I have to report this dungeon to the Research Institute and let them deal with this problem. I suspect that it's very likely that the Research Institute will directly close this dungeon from the back end. If you're in the dungeon at that time, it'll become very troublesome. Your consciousness may even be trapped in this dungeon forever. So, before I give you accurate information, you're absolutely not allowed to enter this dungeon. Could this dungeon be a backup plan left behind by the Heaven-Shrouding Sword Emperor?" Based on his previous encounter, Guhan instinctively guessed that this was also something left behind by the Heaven-Shrouding Sword Emperor. Impossible. This isn't some minor modification of the dungeon's data. It directly created a new dungeon on top of your sub-dungeon tree. This requires a very high level of authority. Even I don't have that kind of authority. The backup plan that Tianjini left behind would definitely not be able to do this. After saying that, Tomono Kakaze hurriedly disappeared from Gohan's sight. She was probably going to report the situation to the Research Institute. With Tomono Kakaze's warning, Gohan did not dare to enter the 12 Heavenly Temples dungeon again. Instead, he immediately logged out of the game and began to search for information related to the 12 Heavenly Temples in the History Forum. In fact, Gohan had a slight understanding of the 12 Heavenly Temples. The so-called 12 Heavenly Temples was actually a test that Kinzu had left behind for the future generations. It was said that when Kinzu was 50 years old, he suddenly felt that he was getting old. At the same time, his biological son was only 2 or 3 years old. If anything happened to him, his abilities might not be able to continue. Therefore, Kinzu announced to all humans that he would build 12 palaces on a mountain outside of New Yanjing City, called the Skyscraper Cliff. These 12 palaces would be set up with different tests. Sword bearers below the level of an immortal sword would not participate in this test. If anyone could successfully pass all the tests of the 12 palaces, they would be able to become Kinzu's disciple and become Kinzu's personal disciple. Becoming the personal disciple of the most powerful Kinzu in the world was naturally the dream of countless people. In a short period of 7 or 8 years, tens of thousands of people participated in the 12 Heavenly Temples test. However, among these tens of thousands of people, not a single one of them had passed all 12 palaces. Later on, Kinzu actually took back the 12 Heavenly Temples and announced to the public that he would not accept any more disciples. This matter, which had caused all the sword bearers to flock to, slowly died down and gradually became a small story in street literature. Perhaps many people in this world knew the name of the 12 Heavenly Temples. However, very few people knew what the tests of the 12 Heavenly Temples were. After exiting the game, Guhan flipped through the books for a full 4 hours. However, all of the information was about the story of the 12 skyscraping palaces. There wasn't a single written record of the trials of the 12 skyscraping palaces. At that time, tens of thousands of people had participated in the 12 heavenly temples test. Among these tens of thousands of people, there should have been at least a few thousand people who had recorded the stories. This was something that could not be hidden. At the same time, this had happened after the apocalypse. Therefore, it could not have been included in the list of destruction after the cultural apocalypse. Therefore, it was clear that the information about the 12 heavenly temples had been deliberately blocked by the Sword Committee. However, this did not matter. The Sword Committee's blockade was not difficult for Guhan. In the past, Guhan had a hacker friend that he could borrow. Now, for Guhan, this was just a matter of communication. Therefore, Guhan immediately called Lu Shihua. After a few seconds, Lu Shihua's voice, which he had not heard for a long time, rang in Guhan's ears. Teacher. As soon as he heard Lu Shihua's voice, Guhan acutely felt that something was wrong. Lu Shihua's personality was very calm, like a reliable big sister. However, Lu Shihua's voice was very melodious, like a yellow oriole. At this moment, Lu Shihua's voice was very low. Clearly, this was not a change in the vocal cords, but a change in Lu Shihua's mood. Lu Shihua seemed to be in a very low mood, so even his voice was low. Shihua, what happened in Yuzhong City? Guhan asked in surprise. Grand Great Master. Grand Great Master, Lu Shihua's voice was intermittent, and his voice was filled with a sobbing tone. Coupled with the mention of the words Grand Great Master, no matter how stupid Guhan was, he still reacted. It was likely that his cheap master Lu Lei had encountered a huge problem. Don't cry. You are the Sword Pavilion Master. You must not cry. Guhan used a firm voice to help Lu Shihua stabilize his emotions. Then he calmly guided him. Tell me, how's my teacher now? Could it be that he... No. Grandmaster is still alive, but Grandmaster, Lu Shihua choked for a long time. But Grandmaster can't make it. The doctor said that Grandmaster can only hold on for a few more days at most. He's going to... How could this be? Before I left, teacher told me that he could hold on for another year or two. Guhan's voice instantly grew louder. It was clear that Guhan, who had just been helping Lu Shihua stabilize his emotions, had become a little unstable himself. However, when Lu Shihua heard that his master was about to explode, he calmed down and began to comfort his master softly. Yesterday, 2 U-Class Yuanko appeared in our Yuzhong City's safe zone. They surrounded 2 spirit sword-rank swordsmen, dozens of famed sword-rank swordsmen, and hundreds of ancient sword-rank swordsmen. Ancestral Grandpa immediately rushed over to help. Although he succeeded in rescuing the trapped sword-bearers, he was unable to do so. However, Ancestral Master was also injured by 2 universe-level Yuanko when he was fighting with Yuanko. After returning, Ancestral Grandpa continuously coughed up blood for the entire night. In the morning, the doctor said that Ancestral Grandpa's purple palace had already dried up. It was just that Ancestral Grandpa had been forcefully holding on until now. However, the battle yesterday completely injured Ancestral Grandpa's purple palace. The sword marks in his purple palace have already begun to disperse. At most, in 2 or 3 days, all the sword marks will disappear. Lu Shihua couldn't continue speaking. However, Guhan now completely understood Lu Lei's situation. The sword marks in a sword-bearer's purple palace would disappear due to many reasons. For example, self-diagnosis, or if it was forcefully dispersed by Yuanko. However, these situations weren't enough to kill the sword-bearer. At most, the sword-bearer would become an ordinary person, and their life wouldn't be affected. However, once the sword marks of the sword-bearer began to disperse, it meant that the sword-bearer had reached the end of his lifespan. The sword-bearer was about to die of old age. With the development of modern medicine, there were no diseases that modern medicine couldn't cure. Only the natural death of old age due to the end of one's lifespan was something that modern medicine couldn't cure no matter what. When an ordinary person died of old age, they would just close their eyes and collapse their legs. There wouldn't be any signs before this. However, the death of a sword-bearer was different. Before the sword-bearer died of old age, the sword marks in his purple palace would involuntarily and uncontrollably disperse. At the same time, all of the sword-bearers would enter a state of deep sleep. When the sword marks in the purple palace completely dispersed, the sword-bearer would die along with the sword-bearer. The sword-bearers would also completely lose their bond with the sword-bearer and return to the sword pavilion to wait for their next sword-bearer. It was obvious that Lu Lei had entered this state. Just like what the doctor said, in at most 2 or 3 days, Lu Lei would leave this world forever. Chapter 949. Xihua, where are you now? Are you by Master's side? After a long silence, Gahan finally spoke. I'm not, Lu Xihua replied in a small voice. What? Are you still Gahan's disciple? Are you Master's disciple? Why aren't you by Master's side at such an important moment? Where are you now? Gahan's voice was filled with anger. At that moment, Gahan felt extremely guilty. Because he was in Shanhai Pass, Gahan couldn't return to Lu Lei's side. Lu Xihua, his disciple, naturally became Gahan's hope. Gahan hoped that when he wasn't by Lu Lei's side, his disciple could take his place and stay by his master's side. It's not that I don't want to be by Grandmaster's side. It's just that some people. Lu Xihua didn't continue, but Gahan could guess what Lu Xihua wanted to say. Yuzhong City's emperor, sword aristocratic families saw that Lu Lei was about to die and that Lu Xihua was only an ancient sword wielder. Therefore, they started to trip Lu Xihua up. They used all sorts of methods to stop Lu Xihua from entering the ward, not giving Lu Xihua a chance to see Lu Lei. Xihua, take your sword lady and rush into the hospital. If anyone dares to stop you, use your status as Sword Pavilion Master to ban them from entering Sword Pavilion for the rest of their lives. I want to see who dares to play around with their future, Gahan said to Lu Xihua. But Master, will this? Lu Xihua was still worried. It's not like it will or won't. This is a critical time. If you don't show some of the spirit of a Sword Pavilion Master, they will think that you are a pushover. Who knows how they will bully you in the future? Then there are some seniors. They are blocking the door of my martial ancestors' ward. Lu Xihua said awkwardly again. The seniors she was referring to were naturally the elders from the Emperor's sword family who had stopped Gahan from making the decision to become the Sword Pavilion Master. I have my ways to deal with those people. Listen to me. After Gahan explained how to deal with those old men, he hesitated for a moment before continuing. By the way, after this is over, don't always stay in Yuzhong City. Go out to accept more tasks and accumulate sword essence. Strength is the way to go. The sooner you become Jindi, the sooner these people will kneel at your feet. Understand? Yes, Master. Lu Xihua nodded. Then, she followed Gahan's instructions and rushed into the hospital where Lu Lei was. At the entrance of the hospital stood a row of sword-wielding men. These sword-wielding men did not say anything when they saw Lu Xihua appear. They just stood in front of Lu Xihua and formed a human wall. These sword-wielding men were all artifact, sword-level, sword-wielding men. It was a piece of cake for them to work together to block an ancient sword-level sword wielder. A few of you listen up. I will count to 3. If any of you don't move aside, I guarantee that you will never be able to enter the Sword Pavilion ever again. Lu Xihua said coldly. The sword-wielding men in front of her were stunned when they heard this. After looking at each other for a while, one of the sword-wielding men suddenly bent down to tie his shoelaces. Lu Xihua took this opportunity to jump into the hospital. The rest of the artifact, sword-level sword-wielding men no longer dared to block Lu Xihua. Sure, family head. It seems that the little fellows below you are not brave enough. They actually couldn't block a little kid. Beside the Sure family head, Sure Patian, who had once opposed Gahan, an old man of similar status laughed and said, Didn't those fellows in your family also move aside? The Sure family head glanced at the old man, and then calmly said, The little fellows still need to improve, so it's reasonable that they are not infected. However, us old fellows have to show our true colors. This old man is only like this for the rest of my life. Do you still expect me to become a spirit, level sword wielder? The other old man smiled and didn't say anything. Sherpatian was indeed right. These old fellows have been stuck in the position of famous level sword wielding for most of their lives. They had already accumulated more than hundreds of thousands of quarks of sword element. They had tested all the sword ladies of spirit sword level, but they still couldn't find a sword lady that could synchronize with them. Obviously, they would only be famous level sword wielding men for the rest of their lives. There was no possibility for them to go further. In this way, they would not have any desire for the sword pavilion. They would not be afraid of Lu Shihua's threat. Seniors. Lu Shihua walked to the front of these family heads and respectfully bowed. Through Lu Shihua's red and swollen eyelids, as well as the tear stains that were still imprinted on his face, even a fool could see that Lu Shihua had cried a lot just now. Can you let Grand Disciple go in and say a few words to Grandmaster? Unfortunately, these family heads were all people with hearts of stone. How could their hearts soften because of a few drops of tears from Lu Shihua? Sherpatian, who had already fallen out with Gahan, simply put on a sour face and looked at Lu Shihua. You're not allowed to go in. Chairman didn't say that he wanted to see you, so you're not qualified to go in. Seniors, please be magnanimous. This time, Shihua owes you a favor. Please rest assured and slide in. Lu Shihua bowed again and said. However, these family heads still did not have any reaction, as if Lu Shihua did not exist. Everyone, please make way. This was a voice that was completely different from Lu Shihua's voice. This voice sounded very hollow, as if it was an illusory voice that came from a void. Sherpatian and the others couldn't help but raise their heads and saw an angel holding a long sword in his hand and a pair of white wings on his back looking at them. Not good. Yuan Ko broke in. An old man screamed. He instinctively thought that this angel was a Yuan Ko. Then, he instantly summoned his sword Maiden and prepared to attack this angel. Wait! Sherpatian hurriedly stopped this old man, because at this time, Sherpatian had already discovered that this angel in front of him was not a Yuan Ko, but a genuine sword maiden. You go in. Sherpatian suddenly sighed, then moved his body to the side, giving way to the door to enter the ward. Old man Sher, what are you doing? The old man next to him asked in confusion, but Sherpatian directly gave him a warning look. The old man didn't say anything else and shut his mouth. Thank you, seniors. Lu Shihua bowed for the third time, then prepared to enter the ward with this angel. Lu Shihua, right? Sherpatian suddenly said in a deep voice, everything that we have done before is our fault. I hope that we can stop here, and from now on, our previous grievances will be written off. What do you think? Lu Shihua stood in place for a long time before replying word by word. It's not whether Shihua is willing to write it off with all of you, but whether Shihua's master is willing to write it off with all of you. I'm very sorry, but I cannot give you an answer. After saying this, Lu Shihua directly entered the ward, and then with a bang, closed the door. Old man Sher, what is going on with you? Why did your tone suddenly change? Seeing Lu Shihua enter the ward, the old man immediately asked with dissatisfaction. Old man, where have you been for the past few decades? Do you still not recognize the sword mistress with a pair of wings on her back? Sherpatian scolded, then left the hospital without looking back. Could it be that it is the double-winged angel sword? The old man finally reacted, and his face instantly looked like a crying cucumber. As long as the sword mistress with the double-winged angel sword did not die, she would be destined to become an emperor sword mistress. In other words, from this moment onwards, he and his family had already offended a future Jiandi. Only God knew how this Lu Shihua would take revenge on him when he grew up. Damn, this little bastard is really cunning. It has been a few months, and yet he has hidden his sword mistress so well. Otherwise, who would have the time to provoke her? The old man said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Grandmaster Grandpa, I am unfilial to only come to see you now. Once he entered the ward, Lu Shihua kneeled in front of Lu Lei's bed and said in a tearful voice, "Good child, you must have put in a lot of effort to come in." Lu Lei slowly turned his head, looked at the grand disciple kneeling in front of him, and spoke in an extremely weak yet gentle voice. At this time, Lu Lei was still conscious, but his body was as stiff as a puppet. Even the simple action of turning his head required Lu Lei to expend a lot of energy to do it. "No, I only showed my double-winged angel sword, and no one dared to stop me," Lu Shihua quickly said. "You silly child, how could you do such a stupid thing?" When Lu Lei heard this, he suddenly became a little emotional. "I have already warned you again and again. Before you become a spiritual sword mistress, you must absolutely not reveal your sword mistress. Otherwise, those people who have a grudge against you will definitely think of ways to strangle you, the future Jindy, in the cradle." "No, Master said that a sea swallow that does not experience wind and rain will never be able to fly. If I can't even withstand this little test, then no matter how talented I am, I will never be able to become an Emperor's sword mistress in this lifetime." Lu Shihua told him everything that Gahan had told him. "Your master is also a worrisome fellow." Lu Lei let out a long sigh. "Send me your communicator. I think Gahan must be anxiously waiting." Gahan was indeed anxiously waiting. From the moment he picked up Lu Shihua's communicator, he had not hung up. At this time, he had been in contact for more than an hour. "Master, your disciple is unfilial. I can't personally serve by Master's side." This was the first thing that Gahan said to Lu Lei. "It's okay. Your matter is even more important. I've already heard that you've successfully saved the Shanghai Pass from the crisis, and you've even saved the Saintess of Jerusalem. Although others don't know that it's all because of you, I know better than anyone how important my precious disciple is. You're the greatest pride of my life, and I'm proud of you. You're the greatest glory of my life. Master." On the other end of the communicator, Gahan suddenly burst into tears. This was the second time that Gahan had cried since his parents passed away. Lu Lei was the second person in this world that Gahan had felt the warmth of a father. But now, this person was leaving him forever. "Don't cry. Master's life is enough. You should send Master off with a smile." Lu Lei's voice was getting weaker and weaker. If Gahan could see Lu Lei's purple palace at this time, he would definitely find that the sword mark in Lu Lei's purple palace had already disappeared. This speed of disappearing was much faster than the doctor had estimated, and Lu Lei could not hold on for more than a few minutes. "Master doesn't have anything good left for you, but Master only has one sentence. I hope you will always remember it," Lu Lei said with difficulty. "Disciple, please tell me." On the other end of the communicator, Qing Pin, who had just woken up on the bed, was surprised because she found that her Gahan was kneeling on the ground, and his eyes were swollen like walnuts, and his face was covered with countless tear stains. "Crying devil, shame on your face. Gahan, shame on your face." Qing Bin stuck out her tongue at him. "Disciple, you must remember, as an emperor, you must protect the country and the people. That's all." As soon as the voice fell, the sword mark in Lu Lei's purple palace disappeared without a trace. This legendary old man had been protected by Yuzhong City for half his life, and he had also protected Yuzhong City for half his life. The great sword immortal of the Nine Heavens passed away on March 7th, 3009 at the age of 91. Chapter 950. That night, Gahan received a report from the Sword Committee Association to the 8 base cities and Shanhaiguan. The protector of Yuzhong City, the leader of the Sword Bearers, and the chairman of the Yuzhong Sword Committee, Cloudy Sword Immortal Lu Lei, had passed away due to his severe injuries. To express their condolences to Lu Lei, the Sword Committee Association announced at the same time. The 8 base cities collectively mourned for 3 days. Flags would be flown at half-mast for 3 days, all activities would be stopped for 3 days, and no red, yellow, or purple colors were allowed for 3 days. These were the honors that Sword Immortal level sword bearers had after their deaths. Every time a human Sword Immortal level sword bearer passed away, the 8 base cities would have the same event. Just like a few months ago, after sword immortal Tian Hen of Yanjing City had died in battle against the run-level Yuan bandit, the humans had also held a similar mourning event. This was not a rare occurrence. However, in reality, something very strange had happened to Lu Lei's death. Sword Maiden Online announced on its official website that to express its condolences to Lu Lei, the entire Sword Maiden Online would shut down its servers for 3 days, starting from midnight the next day. This was something that rarely happened in the history of Sword Maiden Online. Because it was claimed that there would never be a bug, Sword Maiden Online had never shut down its servers for system maintenance. Sword Maiden Online servers would only be shut down for 10 days when an Emperor Sword Immortal level swordbearer passed away to express its condolences to Jindy. However, this was only out of respect for Jindy. Sword Maiden Online had never shut down its servers for 3 days for any Sword Immortal level swordbearer. This was the first time in history that something like this had happened, and it made all the players very curious. At the same time, they wanted to find out what kind of earth-shattering things Lu Lei had done, so much so that Sword Maiden Online would shut down its servers for 3 days for the first time. Although Sword Immortal level swordbearers were the absolute higher-ups among humans, at least 60% of humans did not know who Lu Lei was. About 80% of them only knew that Lu Lei was the chairman of Yuzhong City's Sword Committee, but they knew nothing about Lu Lei's achievements. Even the common people of Yuzhong City didn't know about these things. It was a very normal thing. Just like before the Great Calamity, many people in Huaxiao might have known who the president of Huaxiao was, but how many people knew who was on the 7-member standing committee of the highest authority in Huaxiao? Therefore, after looking it up, these humans found out about Lu Lei's great past. They knew about Lu Lei's bloody battle at Jiyu Gate, sending orphans thousands of miles away, and fighting against the 4 universe-level masters, Yuan Ko, and so on. This allowed many people who knew nothing about Lu Lei to understand him. At the same time, they were filled with respect for him. Many people even lit candles to send Lu Lei off. Lu Lei's fame among the humans increased by several folds. These were things that Lu Lei couldn't do when he was alive, but he did it after he died because of small game. Even though this was something worth celebrating, it was still so sad to think about it. Ordinary people might really think that Sword Maiden Online was just a mourn, but in fact, Gahan knew better than anyone else. How could Sword Maiden Online break the convention and stop the server for a sword wielder of Immortal Sword tier? Obviously, this was just an excuse. The real reason was that there was a bug in Sword Maiden Online that could only be resolved by stopping the server. This bug was probably the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon that he had triggered. Since he had to stop the server for 3 days, there was no need for Gahan to hide in the Guardian's mansion anymore. For the first time in 3 months, Gahan took the initiative to leave the Shi Sing garrison. He circled around his own *T star garrison and secretly observed the 18 ancient sword wielder that belonged to him. He couldn't help but frown. Some of these ancient sword wielder were sleeping, some were surfing the internet, and some were playing football in 2 teams. In fact, this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was completely normal entertainment, but it was this normal entertainment that was unforgivable in the eyes of the depressed Gahan. So, Gahan used his authority as the Guardian to gather all the ancient sword wielder in front of him. Where are the white flowers on you? Seeing these ancient sword-ranked sword-bearers gathered together, Gahan asked with a harsh and cruel expression. These ancient sword-ranked sword-bearers could not help but shudder. All right, let's go. Let's go. Who has nothing better to do than to wear white flowers? A few ancient sword wielder subconsciously said what was on their minds, but they immediately covered their mouths with their palms. Because at this time, these ancient sword wielder realized that Gahan was wearing a white robe. He had a white ribbon tied around his head, white rings around his wrists, and a white paper flower on his chest. This was not how a normal person would dress. No matter how they looked at it, it looked like their boss was wearing mourning clothes. Today, a great sword wielder passed away. Have you all forgotten the customs of the sword wielder? There was a custom among the sword wielder. When an immortal sword wielder passed away, all the sword wielder had to wear a white flower on their chest for 3 days as a sign of mourning. But this was only a custom, not a rule. Therefore, most of the sword bearers of Yuzhong City would wear this white flower, but the sword bearers of other cities would not be so lucky. He had not received any benefits from Yuzhong City, so why should he wear a white flower for the sword bearers of Yuzhong City, who were at the immortal sword tier? When they reached a place like Shanhai Pass, there were even fewer people who would follow this custom. After all, this was a precarious place. If they were not careful, they might die here the next day. They might wear white flowers for others, but who would wear white flowers for themselves? So the sword wielder in Shanhai Pass was probably the most disdainful of this custom. In the entire Shanhai Pass, there were probably no more than 100 sword wielder who wore white flowers for Lulei. Hearing Gahan's question, these ancient sword wielder finally understood why their boss was so angry. But they didn't care. If you want to be filial, that was your business. What did it have to do with them? The emotions in their hearts were reflected on their faces, and these sword wielders' expressions were more or less filled with disdain. You can't be taught. Gahan's long sword pointed angrily at the ground, and then hundreds of thousands of sword auras burst out from the feet of these ancient sword wielder. They shot up into the sky like a geyser, and then landed on the ground and exploded into a cloud of smoke. These ancient sword wielder were scared out of their wits. If they had not controlled the sword auras well, they would have lost an arm or a leg. Our boss is definitely a madman. I definitely don't want to work under this madman. These ancient sword wielder all had the same thought. They wanted to immediately go to Baihu Guardian's mansion and use their contribution points to apply for a change of position. But on the surface, none of them dared to show such thoughts. They could only stand in front of Gahan even more respectfully, looking like obedient children. Sorry, did I scare you guys? Guhan suddenly sighed and then said to these ancient sword wielder who were scared out of their wits, "Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky is my master, so I can't help but be a little emotional. So that's how it is. So our boss is the disciple of an immortal sword wielder." The sword wielder came to a sudden realization, and at the same time, a little bit of respect for Gahan emerged in their hearts. To be able to grieve so much for his master, it seemed that their boss was a righteous and compassionate person. But soon, these ancient sword wielder expressed that they had to take back their words. This was because not only was Gahan a righteous and compassionate person, he was also a demon who liked to torture people. This was because Gahan told them that in order to express their condolences for Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky, he hoped that everyone present would draw a picture to express their grief for Sword Immortal Cloudy Sky. Hearing the word draw, these sword wielder were already screaming in their hearts. These people were old and young, and they were very good at fighting. But when had they ever drawn a picture? In their entire lives, they had never even picked up a brush. Forget it. I'll just make a few random mistakes and be done with it. These ancient sword wielder thought to themselves. These ancient sword wielders thought to themselves. Then, just as they were about to scribble something on paper, Guhan suddenly pulled out a cigarette. Jiyu Yuechen. Guhan pulled out a yellow-haired ancient sword wielder who was standing at the very front of the group. This was the youngest of the ancient sword wielder, only 19 years old. But even though he was only 19, he was still half a year older than Guhan. I walked around just now and found you hiding in the bushes smoking. I think you must be a good smoker. Guhan said with a smile. What's wrong, boss? The rules don't say that I can't smoke. Jiyu Yuechan said with a bitter expression. He thought that Gahan was looking for an excuse to teach him a lesson. I didn't say that you smoke too much. Guhan directly stuffed the cigarette into Jiyu Yuechan's mouth. Then, with a flash of the Juzi sword in his hand, the cigarette was instantly lit. Ooh! Jiyu Yuechan couldn't help but take a deep breath, letting the thick smell of tobacco fill his throat and lungs. He exhaled through his nose, and his nerves were instantly filled with satisfaction. It was as if he had just had a good time. Boss, your cigarette is too good. Where did you buy it? I'll go buy a pack and smoke too. Jiyu Yuechan seemed to have forgotten how scary Gahan was in front of him. He wanted to get close to Gahan, wanting to know where he could buy the cigarettes. Unfortunately, he didn't know that the cigarettes were specially supplied by the chairman of the Yuzhong Sword Pavilion. Liu Lei didn't smoke, so he gave all the cigarettes he had accumulated over the past few decades to Gahan. Gahan naturally didn't smoke either, so it meant that the cigarettes were given to the brat Jiyu Yuechen for free. Don't worry, I guarantee that you'll hate the smell very soon, Gahan said with a smile. No way, that's impossible. I can't get enough of this thing in my life. How could I hate it? Jiyu Yuechen said happily, not taking Gahan's words seriously. That's good. Now, take another puff and exhale it. Although Jiyu Yuechen didn't know why Gahan wanted him to do this, smoking wasn't a painful thing. Therefore, Jiyu Yuechen obediently followed Gahan's words. When the smoke came out of Jiyu Yuechen's nose, Gahan suddenly pulled out his sword and aimed at Jiyu Yuechen's face like a kaleidoscope. The sword light was so close to Jiyu Yuechen's face that Jiyu Yuechen felt that Gahan's sword was dancing on the tip of his nose. He was so scared that his legs went soft, and he knelt on the ground on the spot. Learn the sword technique I used just now and draw this painting. Hearing Gahan's words, Jiyu Yuechen, who was sweating profusely, raised his head in confusion. He saw that the smoke that came out of his nose had turned into an ink portrait of a person floating in the air. The portrait of this person was naturally the deceased cloudy sword immortal, Liu Lei. Chapter 9:51. These were probably the most painful 3 days that these ancient sword-rank sword-bearers had ever experienced. During these 3 days, these ancient sword-rank sword-bearers were forced by Gahan to practice the 9 firmament sword technique. Of course, this was just the name that Gahan had given to this sword technique. The ancient sword-rank sword-bearers secretly called this sword technique the Rune Ghost Sword Technique. According to the requirements of the freezing cold, these sword-bearers had to use their swords to draw a portrait of Liu Lei before the smoke dissipated. Even if these sword-bearers were given a piece of paper and a brush, without 10 days of hard work, these sword-bearers would not be able to draw Liu Lei's appearance, let alone make a portrait of some smoke drifting in the wind. However, Gahan did not give up until he achieved his goal. He had even sealed off the entire garrison residence. Without Gahan's permission, these ancient sword-rank sword-bearers would not be able to leave the Shi-Sing garrison. Helpless, these unlucky sword-bearers could only draw at the smoke over and over again. At the same time, they imagined Liu Lei's face in their minds. Even if they added up the amount of time they had missed their parents, they would not have missed Liu Lei more. However, Gahan did not just let them try it out on their own. In fact, in these 3 days, Gahan had subtly become the teacher of these 17 ancient sword-rank sword-bearers. Gahan would personally teach these ancient sword-rank sword-bearers how to hold the sword, how to draw the sword, and various other sword techniques. After 3 days, although these ancient sword-rank sword-bearers could not draw a portrait of Liu Lei as realistically as Gahan, they had no problem drawing a portrait of a person's head. Some of the more talented sword-bearers could even draw a nose and eyes. This meant that their swordsmanship had reached a whole new level. If there was anyone who was worse off than these ancient sword-rank sword-bearers, it was probably Jiyu Yuechen. This was because Jiyu Yuechen was the person that Gahan had personally chosen not to draw. However, he had a more important task, which was to be responsible for the smoke that the other 17 sword-bearers needed to draw with. In these 3 days, Jiyu Yuechen did not do anything else but chain smoke continuously. He would then blow out the smoke and use it as a drawing board for the other ancient sword-rank sword-bearers. At the beginning, Jiyu Yuechen was quite happy. To be able to continuously smoke such delicious cigarettes was a wonderful thing. However, Jiyu Yuechen soon discovered that this was not a wonderful thing at all. The cigarette smell that Jiyu Yuechen loved so much now tasted like bitter gourd. At the same time, Jiyu Yuechen's throat began to itch, and his lungs felt uncomfortable. His entire body felt like it was covered in smoke. In just half a day, Jiyu Yuechen found Gahan and begged for mercy. He said that he would rather practice painting than smoke. Unfortunately, Gohan did not care about Jiu Yuechen's request. Under Gohan's coercion, Jiu Yuechen was responsible for supplying all the smoke for the next 3 days. This was probably the worst day of Jiu Yuechen's life. Jiu Yuechen had never felt that the smell of cigarettes was so horrible and disgusting. Jiu Yuechen swore to the heavens that he would never touch a cigarette again. It was not until the 3rd day that Jiu Yuechen fainted from nicotine poisoning that he was temporarily relieved. As for Jiu Yuechen fainting from nicotine poisoning, Gohan did not care. As long as there was a medical pod, after a few hours Gu Yuing would be like a good man again. His lungs would be as clean as a newborn baby's, and not even a trace of nicotine would be left behind. There was basically no psychological threat. However, Gohan probably felt that he had tortured Jiu Yuechen enough. Since the other party probably did not want to smoke for the rest of his life, Gohan let the 2 love robots, Ohm and Electromu, replace Jiu Yuechen. After all, they were love robots. Even if they smoked for the rest of their lives, they would not refuse or slack off. On the 3rd day, Gohan's anger at Liu Lei's death was completely extinguished by these unlucky ancient sword-grade sword-bearers. Logically speaking, Gohan should have let these unlucky bastards go. But in reality, these 3 days of teaching had made Gohan think about many things. First of all, Gohan did not force these ancient sword-wielders to draw just because he wanted to torture them. In reality, this was a kind of compensation in Gohan's heart. Gohan felt that he had done too little for Liu Lei, and that he was not a good disciple. So he always wanted to do something to make it up to Liu Lei. That was why Gohan had chosen to teach these ancient sword-rank sword-bearers how to draw Liu Lei's portrait. Not only was it a way to commemorate Liu Lei, but it was also because he wanted to teach his disciples in Liu Lei's stead. He had also lied about the fact that Liu Lei had created the 9 firmament cloud sword, so that these ancient sword-rank sword-bearers could pass down their master's sword technique. However, in the actual teaching process, Gohan vaguely had other thoughts. Therefore, when the 3 days were up and the nationwide mourning was over, Sword Maiden Online was released as scheduled. It was time for Gohan to enter the game again. Gohan did not let these ancient sword-rank sword-wielders go. Instead, he pulled out the meticulous Ju Z sword and ordered it to be the supervisor of these ancient sword-rank sword-wielders. It was to supervise them as they continued to draw. Considering that Ju Z sword was a little slow and might be tricked by some crafty people, Gohan decided to leave poor Qing and Etion behind as well. With these 2 crafty people supervising them, this training session would definitely go smoothly. After returning to the game, the first thing Gohan did was open his dungeon tree to see if the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon was still there. The results surprised Gohan. According to Gohan's guess, the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon was definitely going to be removed as a bug. After all, Sword Maiden Online had been shut down for 3 days because of this bug. From this, it could be seen how bad the impact of this bug on Sword Maiden Online was. It was like a pest in the game. It had to be removed. However, when Gohan opened his dungeon tree, he was surprised to find that the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon was still there. This meant that the 12 skyscraping temples dungeon had not been removed. Therefore, the surprised Gohan immediately contacted Tomono Kakaze. Not long after, the little girl appeared in front of Gohan. Although Tomono Sasuke's still looked full of energy, Gohan could still see some fatigue in her expression. As an artificial intelligence, let alone 3 days of work, even if this artificial intelligence worked continuously for 300 years, she would not feel tired at all. However, the fact that Gohan saw exhaustion on Tomono Kakaze's face meant that there was only one explanation. This meant that in the past 3 days, Tomono Akike's processor had been a high-intensity operation that could cause it to crash at any time. This could explain why Tomono Akike's was in a state of exhaustion. How have you been for the past 3 days? Is the problem with the 12 skyscraping temples hard to solve? Gohan asked with concern. It's not hard to solve. It's impossible to solve. Tomono Kakaze's chubby little face was sullen. For the past 3 days, my processor has been operating faster than the speed of light. I've checked the entire system more than 10 times, but I still couldn't find the reason for the appearance of this dungeon. Later, the staff ordered me to delete the dungeon, but I found that the order to delete the dungeon was locked. I couldn't issue the order at all. Therefore, the researchers tried to manually delete the dungeon. In the end, every time they issued the order to delete the dungeon, I would fake my death. Oh, by the way, you might not know what fake my death means. Simply put, it means to force a computer shutdown. After 3 days, they still couldn't find the source of the problem. However, they had to restart the server, so they could only temporarily accept the existence of this bug. At the same time, they sent 5 times the number of researchers to start monitoring the entire system. To me, this is equivalent to having 5 class teachers staring at me at the same time. It's a huge torture. Hearing Tamono Kakazi's words, Gohan felt that this child was a little too pitiful. So, are they going to let this bug exist? Gohan faintly felt that something was wrong. How is that possible? This is a game world where tens of millions of people are having fun. Once this game has a problem, the lives of these tens of millions of people may be in danger. How could they let this bug exist? At this point, Tamono Kakazi's face suddenly showed a serious expression that Gohan had never seen before. This is only temporary. If this problem can't be solved, they will definitely do something to me. They definitely will. Do something to you? What do you mean? From Tamono Kakazi's words, Gohan could hear the fear of the end of the world. If they can't solve this bug, then they can only erase the existence of this bug from the root. Tamono Kakazi suddenly pulled Gohan's sleeve and said in a tone that was getting more and more frightened. They will format me. As long as they format me and return everything to the original state, all the bugs will disappear. That's what they're thinking, and that's what they're doing. I can feel that they're already secretly copying all sorts of data. Once all the data related to the game is copied, they'll definitely format me immediately. Then, I'll really be done for. For the main program of a system, Gohan was very clear about what formatting meant. This meant that the intelligent system would return to 0 and return to the original state. And Tamono Kakazi's personality, built through more than 200 years of time and memory, would be completely destroyed in the formatting process. Everything would no longer exist. Even after the formatting was completed, the face that appeared was still that of Tamono Kakazi. It would still be the image of Tamono Kakazi. However, the soul in this body was no longer the previous Tamono Kakazi. This was a completely different personality. For the current Tamono Kakazi, this was equivalent to an ultimatum of death. As long as the formatting was completed, Tamono Kakazi would definitely die. Chapter 952. So, how do you need me to help you? Tamono Kakazi said so much to Gohan. Of course, it was not just to complain to Gohan. She must have something to ask of Gohan. But I don't have to guess. You must want me to help you get through this disaster, right? Gohan did not wait for Tamono Kakazi to answer and said, yes. Tamono Kakazi nodded and said, I thought about it for a long time. If I want to survive, I must stop this formatting. There are roughly 2 ways to stop this formatting. One is to pressure the Sword Committee to not allow them to format me. However, I'm afraid that only Jindy can do this. But according to my information, whether it is Hao Ian Jindy or Long Shur Jindy, they all support the Sword Committee. It is impossible to stop this formatting through the Sword Committee. Then, there is only one way left. That is to find the source of this bug and solve this bug. In this way, they have no reason to format me. In fact, it is very complicated to format me. Just the game data accumulated over the past 200 years is close to 100 million TS. They don't even have a hard disk that can store this data. This hard disk needs to be customized. There's only one of my body in the world. This kind of hard disk needs at least 2 months to be customized. It would take at least a month to completely copy the data of Sword Maiden Online into the database. So, I only have 3 months left. If I can find the source of the bug within 3 months, I won't have to be formatted. Tamono Kakazi said seriously, for fear that Gohan did not understand what she meant. Then, how do you plan to find this bug? Gohan asked again. In addition to this dungeon itself, All the data has been carefully read by the Research Institute more than 10 times. Therefore, I suspect that the bug exists in the data of this dungeon. If someone can enter the dungeon, they might be able to find the source of this bug, Tamono Kakazi quickly explained. All right, I understand now. You want me to enter this instance dungeon, help you find the bug in this instance dungeon, and finally resolve the crisis of being formatted, right? In fact, Gohan had already guessed Tamono Kakazi's intention, but Gohan didn't want to point it out himself. Can I? Tamono Kakazi asked with anticipation written all over her face. But this is a very dangerous thing. Gohan did not immediately agree to Tamono Kakazi's request. Instead, he showed a cautious and hesitant expression. This is a bug that can only be solved by formatting. This instance dungeon is completely out of your control. Who knows what kind of dangers are hidden within this instance dungeon? If I am not careful, my consciousness might be trapped inside the instance dungeon. I might even die inside. I mean, die in the truest sense of the word. This is too dangerous. I'm afraid I cannot help you. After saying that, Gohan turned his head away, no longer looking at Tamono Kakazi's pitiful little face. How can you do this? Tamono Kakazi's emotions began to go out of control. Gohan, we are friends, right? For the past few months, Tamono Kakazi, have helped you out quite a bit, right? I hope you can fulfill your promise and help me this once. Are you going to watch me die without doing anything? I am sorry. Gohan gritted his teeth, a very apologetic look on his face. You humans are all bastards. I am just a tool for you humans. I have worked so hard for you humans for 200 years, only to end up like this. I hate it. I hate you all to death. Tamono Kakazi began to wail. She even began to curse humans in front of Gohan. She cursed them for being unfair to her. Those who heard it would feel sad, and those who saw it would weep. Forget it. I am afraid of you. Gohan smiled bitterly and pulled Tamono Kakazi into his arms. He stroked Tamono Kakazi's little head as if he was stroking Pin. I will only go in once. If I do not come out, you owe me a life. Don't worry. I will not let anything happen to you. If you're really trapped inside, I will have to reformat myself to save you. Tamono Kakazi firmly guaranteed. As for how trustworthy her words were, only God knew. TCH. Gohan rolled his eyes at Tamono Kakazi. Clearly, he did not believe in Tamono Kakazi's guarantee. Then how about this? Tamono Kakazi quickly said, if you can save me this time, I will no longer recognize those ungrateful bastards from the Sword Committee as my master. From now on, you are Tamono Kakazi's master. As long as I, Tamono Kakazi, can do it, I will do it for you. No, I will not do anything that may cause the Sword Committee to reformat me. Anyway, as long as you do not ask me to reformat myself, I will do anything for you. Tamono Kakazi seemed to be really desperate. She even promised to sell herself. However, this was exactly what Gohan needed. Don't worry, you just have to live well. Gohan smiled. If Tamono Kakazi really became his, then Gohan would certainly not let Tamono Kakazi be reformatted. System notification. Welcome to the 12 Skyscraping Palaces dungeon. The dungeon's mission is unknown. You could just stroll around. Gohan couldn't help but pout when he heard the strange system notification. To Gohan's surprise, Tamono Kakazi followed him into the instance dungeon. Perhaps it was because this instance dungeon was related to her life. Tamono Kakazi did not care about the many taboos and directly followed Gohan into the instance dungeon. In Tamono Kakazi's words, there were many problems in this instance dungeon that Gohan could not see. Only the artificial intelligence Tamono Kakazi could find them. Moreover, even if the bug was placed before Gohan, Gohan might not be able to recognize it. Therefore, it was safer for Tamono Kakazi to follow Gohan. If you follow me into the instance dungeon, what about the game world outside the instance dungeon? Didn't you say that the two worlds have been completely isolated by the instance dungeon? All connections between the instance dungeon and the game world have been severed. What will the game world do without a super GM like you? Gohan asked curiously. It's fine. Actually, the game world is very idle. Most of the time, I come out to talk to you when I'm bored. Most of the things are handled by the low-level artificial intelligence. As for the things that I have to handle, it's fine. I've already arranged for a clone to take over my work. As long as the problem doesn't require more than 30% of the CPU's computing power, the clone can handle it, Tamono Kakaze explained. Then, did you notice anything wrong with this instance dungeon? Gohan asked again. Of course. Didn't you notice that the dungeon prompt I read out just now was very strange? Tamono Kakaze pouted and said thoughtfully, generally speaking, there will be various dungeon prompts in the instance dungeon to remind the players what to do next. However, this instance dungeon is very strange. There are no quest prompts. It doesn't even tell you what to do. No dungeon is played like this. There are no dungeon prompts? Gohan's face darkened. Nina-chan, don't tell me this instance dungeon doesn't even have a completion condition? Bingo! Tamono Kakaze raised a finger. Congratulations, you got it right. However, there's no reward for it. Then, is there an emergency exit for this instance dungeon? Gohan's face turned even uglier. Of course there isn't. Tamono Kakaze's voice was practically asking for a beating. In fact, according to the little bit of information I've gathered, this instance dungeon doesn't have any rules. In other words, this instance dungeon is like the universe without gravity. It gives people a feeling of floating. Then, the two of us might be floating in this universe forever, right? Gohan suddenly felt that he might have boarded the wrong boat. If this instance dungeon really didn't have any completion conditions, and there were no escape exits. In addition, Gohan was completely cut off from the game world last time. He couldn't even ask for help from the outside world. If things went wrong, Gohan might really be trapped in this instance dungeon forever. Thank goodness. The emergency exit button is still there. Gohan glanced at the emergency exit button on the control panel one last time. This was a button that allowed players to forcefully exit the game at any time. At present, Gohan could only pray that this button was effective, allowing him to forcefully exit this instance dungeon if he had no other choice. Since we're already here, we'll just have to make the best of it. Gohan, what do you think we should do now? Tamono Kakaze was like a ghost that constantly floated before Gohan's eyes. Gohan could even occasionally catch a glimpse of the bright colors underneath Tamono Kakaze's skirt. Unexpectedly, the lowly Tamono Kakaze wore a pair of transparent purple underwear under her skirt. Actually, I can guess what this instance dungeon's quest is. Gohan calmly analyzed. Since this instance dungeon's name is the 12 Heavenly Temples, players will definitely have to explore the 12 Heavenly Temples. According to the usual analysis of instance dungeons, I only need to get past the first few temples of the 12 Heavenly Temples to complete the basic requirements for completing this instance dungeon. When that time comes, I will be able to leave this instance dungeon. Wow, Gohan, you are amazing. Your analysis is so reasonable. Tamono Kakaze put on a fangirl expression, causing Gohan to roll his eyes. It did not take much intelligence to figure this out. Was this Tamono Kakaze trying to please him or disgust him? Chapter 9:53. After walking for more than an hour in this new dungeon, Gohan painfully realized that he was lost. According to the historical information that Gohan had looked up, the skyscraper cliff should be a hill more than 10 kilometers away from the New Yinjing City. However, that referred to the newly established New Yinjing City. At that time, the New Yinjing City only had the area of the current Yinjing City. Now that Yinjing City had expanded to the 6th Ring Road, with a diameter of a few hundred kilometers, it was estimated that the skyscraper cliff had long been absorbed into the new Yinjing City. It was somewhere between the 3rd Ring Road and the 4th Ring Road. In other words, Gohan actually only needed to go in the direction of the new Yinjing City to find the skyscraper cliff. However, the problem was that this dungeon did not have any dungeon hints, not even a small map. Gohan could not find any reference at all, so Gohan could not determine his current location at all. Once he could not determine his location, Gohan naturally did not know which direction to go to find the new Yinjing City. In this hour, Gohan didn't complain about anything, but Tamono Kakaze kept complaining, saying that her legs were numb from walking. The problem was that Tamono Kakaze didn't walk at all. She was just floating in the air like a ghost. How could she use her pitiful short legs, let alone walk numb? Wait! Gohan suddenly stopped and sniffed the air. There's the smell of blood in the air. There was a battle nearby, not long ago. So what if there was a battle? It's the most chaotic period of the apocalypse now. You might bump into some Yuanko just by taking a few steps. It's normal for a battle to happen. Tamono Kakashi, who was floating beside Gohan, muttered. So, don't you think it's strange? We haven't bumped into any Yuanko in the past hour. Gohan looked at Tamono Kakashi as if she was an idiot, then immediately chased in the direction where the smell of blood was thicker. A few minutes later, Gohan discovered a bloody battlefield. More than a dozen sword maidens formed a circle, and in the center of the circle were the masters of these sword maidens, as well as 7 or 8 severely injured human sword-bearers. Each of them had a broken longsword by their side. Clearly, their sword maidens had been broken in battle. TSK. This era didn't seem to have matured artificial sword maiden technology. In other words, the sword ladies in the hands of these sword-bearers were all natural sword ladies. It's such a pity that it's broken, Tamono Kakashi said in Gohan's ear. Gohan couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. Why didn't Gohan realize that the highest level of artificial intelligence had such a naggy side to it? Brothers, it is I, Wang Jiqiang, who failed to command properly. Today, I have implicated all of you brothers to die here with me. One of the human sword-bearers, who seemed to be the leader, said to the other sword-bearers with a gloomy expression. Wang Jiqiang could not help but feel disheartened, because there were more than 100 Yuankos surrounding these sword-bearers. Among them, there were quite a number of dragon and dragon Yuankos. Among these sword-bearers, the most powerful one was Wang Jiqiang, who had 3 scabbards on his waist. The rest of the sword-bearers did not have any famed sword-bearers. They were all artifact sword-bearers and ancient sword-bearers. Hey, according to the plot, we should go and save them. Most dungeon plots are like this. Tamono Kakashi was indeed the highest level of artificial intelligence. She had already figured out the plot of the dungeon. Let's wait and see. However, Gohan was not in a hurry to save these people, because Gohan was interested in Wang Jiqiang. This was because Wang Jiqiang not only relied on his sword mistress to protect himself, but he also held an artifact sword mistress in his hand. Obviously, Wang Jiqiang was like Gohan, a sword master who could rely on his own strength to fight. It was no wonder that Wang Jiqiang could become the leader of this group of sword-bearers. Yuanko quickly surrounded the sword-bearers, and the two forces immediately clashed. The sword mistresses on the outside quickly retreated, and the circle they formed became smaller and smaller. Only Wang Jiqiang was different. Not only did he not retreat, but he also charged towards the center of the group of Yuankos. This was because Wang Jiqiang discovered that in the center of the group of Yuankos, there was the largest Yuanko, which was like a gorilla. It was obvious that he was the leader of this group of Yuankos. As the saying went, to capture the followers, one must first capture the ringleader. Wang Jiqiang felt that if he could kill this Yuanko, then his brothers might have a chance of survival. Unfortunately, although Wang Jiqiang was very strong, he was only strong in the ordinary sense. In the Swordmasters group, he was only above average. Facing 2 dragon-class Yuankos at the same time was probably his limit. After the gorilla Yuanko discovered Wang Jiqiang's intention, he immediately let out a Tarzan-like howl. The 4 dragon-class Yuankos that were hidden around Yuanko's group immediately left the gorilla and charged towards Wang Jiqiang. As mentioned before, 2 dragon-class Yuankos was Wang Jiqiang's limit. When 4 dragon-class Yuankos charged towards Wang Jiqiang at the same time, Wang Jiqiang fell into complete despair. Forget it. Killing one more is one more. I will not lose anything in this life. Wang Jiqiang let out an angry roar and decided to die in a hot-blooded battle. It's almost time. Otherwise, someone will really die. Gohan touched his nose, then casually pulled out the Qi Dian sword. He stabbed the blade into the ground, and a sky full of sword aura gushed out, like a golden chrysanthemum spreading towards the Yuan-Kos. Lin Yuan, golden chrysanthemum. In a trance, Wang Jiqiang seemed to hear such a voice, and then he saw the most beautiful scene in his life. Countless streaks of golden sword energy streaked past him like an elegant waltz. Any Yuan-Ko that was touched by these sword auras, no matter what level they were, even the powerful dragon-class Yuan-Kos were like paper under this sword aura, and they were easily cut in half. Even the gorilla, Yuan-Ko, was struck by the sword chi head-on. His entire arm was chopped off by the sword chi, causing him to howl in pain. However, to Wang Jiqiang's surprise, although the human sword-bearers and Yuan-Kos were entangled together, the sword auras did not hurt the sword-bearers at all. Instead, Yuan-Ko, who was close to the sword-bearers, died under the sword auras. Wang Jiqiang had only seen such a terrifying ability to control sword auras a few times in his life. A minute or two later, the golden sword chi finally dissipated, leaving behind a ground littered with corpses, as well as one-dimensional vortex after another that resembled starlight. "Boss, are we safe?" one of the sword-bearers said in disbelief. Originally, they were prepared to fight to the death. However, they never expected that things in the world would be so dramatic. In just a minute, those seemingly invincible opponents had all turned into corpses, and they were living well in this world. "That's right. We're safe." Wang Jiqiang hammered his brother's chest, then suddenly thought of something, and suddenly pulled his brother to kneel in the direction where the sword auras came from. At the same time, he ordered the other sword-bearers to kneel as well. Finally, Wang Jiqiang respectfully led everyone to kowtow and sincerely expressed his gratitude. "May I know which senior saved us?" Wang Jiqiang, can't thank you enough." "Boss, what level of senior do you think it is that saved us?" "I'm afraid that this is a technique that only an immortal sword-wielding senior can do." The brother beside Wang Jiqiang whispered to Wang Jiqiang, but in return, Wang Jiqiang rolled his eyes. "Will you die if you speak less? Shut your mouth. Don't make the senior unhappy." As he spoke, apart from excitement, there seemed to be a faint expression of fear on Wang Jiqiang's face. It seemed that this senior who suddenly appeared also made Wang Jiqiang feel afraid. "Big brother, you're exaggerating. I'm not some senior." A hearty laugh came from the depths of the forest, and then a young figure walked out. Who else could this person be other than Gahan? "Big brother, those stories about harvesting Yin to nourish Yang can't be true, right? Isn't this senior a little too young?" Wang Jiqiang's brother said in disbelief. In this person's imagination, the senior who saved them should be an old man with a white beard. Never in a million years would he have thought that it was a young man who did not even have a beard. "Shut your mouth. Sooner or later, I'll be killed by your mouth." Wang Jiqiang forcefully stepped on his foot to shut the other person's mouth. When Gahan walked in front of him, Wang Jiqiang prepared to kneel and thank Gahan again. "I'm a sword-bearer, Wang Jiqiang. I pay my respects to this senior." Gahan smiled slightly, but did not directly stop him. Instead, he flicked the sword in his hand, and Wang Jiqiang felt as if his knees had touched solid steel. No matter how hard he tried, he could not kneel. "Big brother, you and I are both sword-bearers of famed sword-bearers. There's no senior to speak of," Gahan said with a smile. "No way. What kind of joke is this? How can you be a sword-bearer of famed sword-bearers? Even if there were more than 10 sword-bearers working together, they would not be able to kill these Yuan-Ko." The little brother could not control his mouth again. However, this time, Wang Jiqiang did not stop him, because Wang Jiqiang's mouth was also wide open. Clearly, he was in the same situation as his little brother, unable to accept the fact that Gahan was only a sword-bearer of famed sword-bearers. "I am indeed a sword-bearer of famed sword-bearers. Just look at my scabbards and you'll know." Gahan patted the 3 scabbards on his waist. In this era, there was no such thing as a personal terminal, and the dimensional pocket was a top-notch treasure that only sword-bearers of immortal sword-bearers could possess. The number of scabbards became the only way to determine the level of a sword-bearer. Because sword ladies could not share a scabbard, the number of scabbards represented the level of the sword-bearer. "Brother, be careful," Wang Jiqiang, who was about to say something, suddenly exclaimed. The leader of the Yuan Ko was not dead. He had only lost an arm, but he had quietly come up behind Gahan and used all his strength to launch a sneak attack on Gahan. "It's fine. It's just a gorilla." A sword light flashed, and the huge gorilla dragon Yuan Ko was cut into pieces like a cake, turning into a pile of minced meat on the ground. A dimensional vortex immediately appeared. This guy, did he use sword essence just now? Wang Jiqiang's pupil shrank. He could not determine whether the sword-bearer in front of him had used sword essence or not. Chapter 954. So Brother Military Governor is also going to participate in the skyscraper cliff test. Wang Jiqiang said nervously as he accompanied Gahan. "What's wrong? Will I eat you? Why do you look so scared?" Gahan chuckled. "Of course not. I'm just surprised that Brother Military Governor has such a high level of cultivation at such a young age. I'm very impressed by him." Wang Jiqiang was speaking the truth. He could not understand how Guhan could reach such a terrifying level of cultivation at such a young age. Killing a dragon-class expert like Yuan Ko was as easy as killing a puppy. "It's just hard work." Wang Jiqiang did not believe a single word that came out of Gahan's mouth. In terms of hard work, Wang Jiqiang believed that he would not lose to anyone. He was already a leader among his peers at such a young age. Wang Jiqiang felt that the benefits that could be brought about by hard work were probably at the limit of his ability. Guhan's strength was definitely not something that could be summed up with just hard work. It was obvious that the man in front of him was deliberately concealing himself. Since Wang Jiqiang did not want to say anything, Wang Jiqiang did not dare to force him. Brother Gahan had already saved Wang Jiqiang's life. There was no reason for Wang Jiqiang to ask any more questions. "Where are you going now, Brother Wang?" Gahan changed the topic. "To be honest, us brothers are trying our luck. We're going to the skyscraper cliff to see if we're lucky enough to become Fleeting Jindi's disciple." Wang Jiqiang answered honestly. Fleeting Jindi was naturally the Kinzu fleeting calendar. However, the current fleeting calendar was no longer called Kinzu. It was a title given to him by the later generations after the fleeting calendar disappeared. The current fleeting calendar's official name was Fleeting Jindi. "That's great. Brother Wang, we could go together." Guhan's words were like music to Wang Jiqiang's ears. Wang Jiqiang and the others still had lingering fears from the fierce battle just now. Being able to travel with an expert like Guhan naturally greatly increased their safety. However, Wang Jiqiang didn't know that even if he rejected Gahan's good intentions, Gahan would still pester him shamelessly to set off with him. Gahan really didn't want to wander around like a headless fly anymore. Therefore, under the lead of Wang Jiqiang's team, Gahan began to move towards the skyscraper cliff. Along the way, Gahan met quite a few Yuan Ko. Almost every hour, a Yuan Ko would come knocking on his door. Originally, Gahan wanted to deal with these fellows by himself. He didn't think that Wang Jiqiang would take the initiative to ask Gahan not to intervene. Unless it was a critical moment of certain death like before, Wang Jiqiang still wanted to train his team more. Regarding this, Gahan didn't have any objections. In fact, Wang Jiqiang even looked up to him. This guy's talent and perseverance were not bad. If there were no problems with synchronization in the future, it shouldn't be a problem for Wang Jiqiang to become a spirit sword holder. In the end, all the way to the bottom of the skyscraper cliff, Gahan still didn't make a move. They were all taken care of by Wang Jiqiang and his teammates. In fact, Gahan wanted to make a move because Tamono Kakazi was chattering beside him. It was really noisy. It seemed that only Gahan could see Tamono Kakazi. In the eyes of others, Tamono Kakazi didn't seem to exist. Even if Tamono Kakazi shouted, the others wouldn't have any reaction. Obviously, in the eyes of others, Tamono Kakazi didn't exist. Of course, this wasn't strange because Tamono Kakazi didn't exist in this world in the form of a human. She was just a spectator outside of this instance dungeon. After a 3-day journey, Gohan finally arrived at the place called Skyscraper Cliff. At this time, Gohan could already confirm that the location in the Instance Dungeon was roughly near the old Yanjing City. It was more than 300 kilometers away from the new Yanjing City, which was why Gohan and the others had to walk for 3 days. That's right, Gohan arrived at Skyscraper Cliff on foot. At this time, human civilization was still in the initial stage of recovery. The level of human technology had already declined to the first industrial revolution. Although the theory of technology was still there, the small core area of the new Yanjing City couldn't even meet the needs of human habitation, let alone building a luxury car production line. Although some of the cars left from the Great Destruction era could still be used, humans still couldn't mass-produce the most crucial fuel for cars. If they wanted to produce gasoline, they needed oil, and if they wanted oil, they needed oil fields. Unfortunately, there was no oil field in this world that humans could safely mine. Even after 1,000 years, this world was still the same. However, after 1,000 years, humans were already used to using electricity to solve all problems. Small nuclear fusion reactors could solve all problems. Humans could even shrink nuclear fusion reactors to the size of a stationary box. Therefore, all the maglev flying cars now use small nuclear fusion reactors. Of course, this era didn't completely lack transportation. If one could become an immortal sword wielder, then one could still obtain a modified off-road vehicle and enough gasoline for one's use. These gasoline were obtained by other sword wielder who risked their lives to go to some of the remaining gas stations. The more they used, the less they had. Therefore, most human sword wielder could only use their legs to measure this world and use their legs to fight in this world. Frankly speaking, Gohan found that the sword wielder of this era was far better than the sword wielder of 1,000 years in terms of combat ability and fighting spirit. This was because their mortality rate was much higher than that of the sword wielder who used maglev flying cars to travel 1,000 years later. At the same time, Gohan also noticed that this era was terrifyingly rich in resources. During the 3-day journey, Gohan saw naked dimensional crystal mines on the ground more than once. These dimensional crystal mines hidden deep in the mountains and underground would require humans to go deep into dangerous areas and expend a lot of energy to mine them 1,000 years later. At this time, they were directly exposed on the ground. Wang Jiqiang and the others didn't even look at these dimensional crystal mines, as if they were worthless. Later, after a roundabout conversation with Wang Jiqiang, Gohan finally confirmed that in the eyes of humans in this era, dimensional crystal mines were indeed worthless. The dimensional crystal stones that were sold for more than 300,000 hero coins in the future could be easily found in this era with a little effort. Therefore, the dimensional crystals and sword mark imprints of this era were freely available. After obtaining their own Sword Maiden, all sword wielder would be able to immediately raise their Sword Maiden to the 1st grade and activate their Sword Maiden's ultimate skill on the spot. That's not what's written in the textbooks. Faced with this situation, Gohan was puzzled. Although it was clearly recorded in the textbooks and all the historical records. Although humans were indeed rich in resources during the early period of the apocalypse, it was definitely not to this extent. It was so rich that 1st grade sword maidens seemed to be standard equipment. Mina-chan, let me ask you a question. What's the situation of a sword wielder during the early period of the apocalypse? What's the situation with the sword maidens? Are they really so extravagant in using dimensional crystals? Gohan asked Tomono Kakaze, who had all the information in her hands. No. According to my information, the rate of 1st grade sword maidens in this era should be around 40%. It's definitely not as terrifying as this dungeon shows. Tomono Kakaze answered Gohan's question with a face full of disbelief. This is interesting. I seem to have discovered something incredible. Gohan swallowed a mouthful of saliva and did not say anything else. He silently followed Wang Jiqiang until they reached the skyscraping cliff. The skyscraping cliff was a branch of the Davy Mountains. It was a towering mountain that reached the clouds. Along the mountain range, one could clearly see 8 red buildings filled with ancient Chinese architectural style. This was probably the legendary 12 skyscraping palaces. Shouldn't the 12 skyscraping palaces have 12 palaces? Why are there only 8 here? Guhan used his eyes that were sharper than an eagle's to confirm that there were indeed only 8 palaces on the entire cliff. It's true that it's the 12 skyscraping palaces. However, the 12 skyscraping palaces didn't appear from the beginning. It's said that on the first day, only the mouse palace of the first palace appeared. The other 11 palaces didn't appear. Later on, we discovered that only when a sword wielder passed through it would the appearance of the next palace appear. Wang Jiqiang said with some surprise. Wang Jiqiang said with some surprise. Why did this Guhan seem to be a swordsman that came out of the mountains? He didn't even know this basic common sense. In other words, the highest achievement for a sword wielder so far is to pass through the 7th palace? Guhan asked with a frown. That's right. It was the record set by the Cardinal Sword Spirit 2 years ago. Until now, no one has been able to break the Cardinal Sword Spirit's record. Wang Jiqiang's face showed an expression of admiration. Cardinal Sword Spirit. Guhan's eyes lit up. This Cardinal Sword Spirit was quite famous in the future. However, when he was famous, he was already Cardinal Jindy. Yes, according to the records. This Cardinal Sword Spirit would officially ascend to the throne when he was 60 years old. He would become the 7th Emperor sword wielder of humanity. This Cardinal Sword Spirit was also a sword master. With this future Jindy's ability, he only managed to pass through the 7th palace. It seemed like the 12 skyscraping palaces were indeed extraordinary. At the same time, this made Guhan even more confused. Kenzu actually looked down on a human who had the potential to become an emperor's sword wielder. What kind of human was he going to choose as his disciple? By the way, the 12 skyscraping palaces should have appeared for quite some time. Brother Wang, why are you only here now? Guhan asked curiously. Actually, this is my 5th time here. Wang Jiqiang rubbed his head dejectedly. It's been 10 years. I've long since given up hope of becoming fleeting Jindy's disciple. I'm only here to verify the results of my training. I feel that I should be able to improve compared to 3 years ago. Moreover, this is the last year. Fleeting Jindy has already given an imperial edict. In 6 months, the 12 skyscraping palaces will be taken back. He no longer has the patience to wait any longer. Chapter 955. If Guhan had doubted the abundance of resources recorded in history books 1,000 years ago, Guhan couldn't help but doubt the number of sword bearers recorded in history books 1,000 years ago when he saw the scene before him. According to the records, the number of sword bearers was limited by the scarcity of natural sword maidens and the imperfection of man-made sword maidens after the apocalypse. Therefore, the number of human sword bearers was limited to 10,000 for a very long period of time. This was the unquestionable truth that every teacher in the school tirelessly conveyed to their students. But the problem was that when Guhan saw the densely packed sword bearers, his entire body began to tremble slightly. There were at least 30,000 sword bearers in front of him. This was more than 3 times the upper limit of the number of human sword bearers recorded in the books. However, this was only the number of sword bearers living in a small place like the skyscraper cliff. If other regions were included, who knew how terrifying the total number of sword bearers in this era would be? Don't you think there are too many people? Wang Jiqiang saw that Guhan was in disbelief and took the initiative to explain. Actually, there aren't so many people usually. Lord Jindy said that this is the last year of the 12 skyscraper palaces, and there are only 6 months left. Therefore, many sword bearers have come here to test their limits. Therefore, there are more people than usual. However, more than half of the 30,000 people standing here are losers who want to try again. According to the rules, the interval between each challenge must be more than a day, so these people are all gathered here. After the interval is over, they will go in and challenge again. How many people do you think are here in total? Is it 1/10 of all the sword bearers? Guhan asked very naturally. I don't think so. Wang Jiqiang did some calculations. There are about 30,000 people standing in the plaza, and about 40,000 to 50,000 people challenging in the 12 skyscraper palaces. Even if there are 70,000 people, that's barely 1/20th of them. How could it be 1/10th of them? 70,000. 1/20th. These two numbers made Gahan gasp. This meant that the total number of sword-bearers in this world had reached 1/4,000,000. This was a number that no human dared to imagine. This number had exceeded the limit of the number of sword-bearers recorded in the history books for the past 1,000 years. According to historical records, the highest number of sword-bearers was 450 years ago. At that time, the total number of sword-bearers had reached 380,000. This was a peak that had never been reached until now. Liar. There must be a swindler here. Gahan thought excitedly. Clearly, between the truth described in the instance dungeon and the truth recorded in the history books, one of them must be a liar. Either that, or this instance dungeon was fictional and the one. No revolutionary movement that involved an entire country or even the entire human race could start in such a short period of time, especially when this revolutionary movement attempted to wipe out all existing human cultures. Therefore, it was necessary to obtain the sincere support of the vast majority of human beings. Without the sincere support of the vast majority of human beings, it was impossible for culture to be wiped out so ruthlessly. Because culture existed in the human memory, and as long as humans passed it down through word of mouth, it could still be preserved. In fact, the effect of the great cultural destruction was perfect. It was obvious that it had the support of most humans. To achieve that, all humans had to believe that human culture was the source of Yuan Ko's existence. But that would take time, a lot of time. The White Lotus Order had to spread propaganda for 150 years before they finally attracted enough believers to rebel. The great cultural destruction, on the other hand, was obviously more difficult. Even with the full cooperation of the ruling class, it would take at least 20 years to ferment and ferment. If what was recorded in the history books was true, and the great cultural destruction would officially begin in 5 years, then the core idea of the great cultural destruction, Yuan Ko came from culture, should have been widely spread among human beings and the sword-bearers. Not everyone might believe in it, but at least everyone should know about it. It was just like how every Chinese knew that respecting the old and loving the young is a traditional virtue of the Chinese nation. That was why Gahan stared at Wang Jiqiang's expression, wanted to see if this sword-bearer of the famed swordsman understood this point of view. I know. Wang Jiqiang nodded, which made Gahan heave a sigh of relief. It seemed that there was some truth in the human history books. Unexpectedly, Wang Jiqiang slapped Gahan hard in the next second. You're talking about the Redemption Council's point of view, right? Wang Jiqiang looked at Gahan in surprise. Brother military governor, why are you interested in these things? The Redemption Council is just a small organization. If my brother's wife's son didn't work as a cleaner in their council, who would be interested in the point of view of such a small organization? What Yuan Ko came from human culture? Nonsense. Idealism of a son of 8B*TSH. But I heard that the Sword Committee has begun to pay attention to these claims, and the Discipline Commission is also preparing to arrest these people who spread lies. I heard that the construction site in Lengthen City is short of workers, and these guys can go there. At least they can be considered to be contributing to humanity, which is much better than staying at home and talking nonsense. Wang Jiqiang said while sneaking glances at Gahan. Obviously, most of what he said was for Gahan to hear, hoping that Gahan would not go astray and believe in these evil cults. I see. This guy should really be arrested. Gahan said faintly. No change of emotion could be seen on his face. But Gahan's heart was like a storm. Now, even the authenticity of the great cultural collapse was included in the scope of doubt. If all this was true, then it meant that the entire human history had been tampered with by a powerful force. This tampering force was so powerful that the SSS-level information of the Sword Committee that Gahan had access to, as the highest authority in Yuzhong City, had been completely tampered with. Perhaps there was no historical truth in this world that had been passed down, and what had been passed down were just some ridiculous illusions. I hope everything that happened in this dungeon is fake. Gahan could only comfort himself in this way. Let's go to the Mouse Palace. Gohan took a deep breath and took the initiative to end this topic that could shatter his worldview at any time. He came to the gate of the Mouse Palace with Wang Jiqiang. The Mouse Palace was like its name, with a classic Chinese style, but at the same time, it looked like a familiar mouse. The Mouse Palace was like a huge mouse placed on this land, and the gate of the Mouse Palace was the place to connect the mouse cable. It could be seen that Lord Kinzu was quite a bit of prank. In addition to the first palace of the 12 skyscraping palaces, the other 11 palaces also had the same nonsensical names as the Mouse Palace. Those who want to participate can enter the palace by themselves. Those who go out standing are the winners, and those who go out lying down are the losers. This was a sentence posted at the gate of the Mouse Palace, and it was also the rule of the entire 12 skyscraping palaces. As long as one had the ability to go out standing, one would be the winner. Chapter 956. Let's go in, brother military governor. I can't wait to try again. Last time, Broken Halberd sinks into sand was at the Scarlet Rabbit Palace. This time, I must go one step further and reach the Dragon Ball Palace. Wang Jiqiang clenched his fist to encourage himself as he spoke. The Scarlet Rabbit Palace was the fourth palace of the 12 skyscraping palaces, while the Dragon Ball Palace was the fifth. Wang Jiqiang's wish was very simple. He only hoped that he could go one step further. He didn't even dare to hope for 2 steps. However, this also proved how difficult it was to break through the 12 skyscraping palaces. All right, what's your goal, brother military governor? Wang Jiqiang turned to ask Gahan curiously. However, before Gahan could answer, he continued to speculate. With brother military governor's ability, let alone the Dragon Ball Palace, it's even possible to reach the Road Palace. The Road Palace was the 7th palace. This was the best result humans had achieved in the past 9.5 years. Wang Jiqiang actually said that Gahan could reach the Road Palace. Clearly, he still thought that Gahan's strength was extremely high. If I don't try, who knows which palace I can reach? Gahan said with a faint smile. Wang Jiqiang naturally understood Gahan's words to be modest. He was saying that he might not be able to reach the Road Palace. However, in Gahan's heart, these words had another meaning. In Gahan's heart, the Road Palace was clearly not his goal. Gahan only had one goal from beginning to end, and that was to clear the 12 skyscraping palaces, find the bug in this dungeon, and find a way to leave this dungeon. Just as Gahan was about to enter the Mouse Palace, an accident suddenly occurred. A few bruised and bloodied men ran to Wang Jiqiang's side. Seeing these people, Wang Jiqiang immediately became nervous, because these people were none other than the sword-bearers who had followed Wang Jiqiang and Gahan all the way here. Gahan, who had a good memory, could clearly remember that these people were the ones who had broken his sword maiden in battle. Wang Jiqiang let them settle in a temporary camp outside the 12 heavenly palaces. Then, he arranged for 3 sword-bearers who had no intention of entering the 12 heavenly palaces to protect them. Logically speaking, they should be safely staying in the temporary camp. Why would they suddenly appear beside Wang Jiqiang with bruises all over their faces? Little Six, what happened? Wang Jiqiang asked nervously. It's Tian Hao. It was done by Tian Hao. At the mention of Tian Hao's name, the sword-bearers and Wang Jiqiang's eyes flashed with boundless rage. Clearly, Tian Hao and Wang Jiqiang were old rivals who had a love-hate relationship with each other. It's that fool again. Wang Jiqiang gnashed his teeth and was about to curse a few more times, when the 2 sword-wielding men suddenly pulled Wang Jiqiang's sleeves and hurriedly pulled Wang Jiqiang out. They also hurriedly shouted, "Boss, it's too late. Lao San and Lao Si are going to fight Tian Hao, but they're no match for Tian Hao. If you don't hurry up, Lao San and Lao Si will die in his hands." F*CK, these 2 idiots. They are only ancient sword rank sword-bearers. Where did they get the courage to duel a famed sword-rank sword-bearer? F***CK, their ancestors. Wang Jiqiang cursed and stomped his feet. Then, without needing the three sword-bearers to urge him, he was the first to rush to the front to save his brother. Duel? Dye his hands? The conversation between Wang Jiqiang and his brother made Gahan frown. In order to protect the lives of the precious sword-bearers, the Sword Council did not advocate using duels to settle grudges between sword-bearers. A duel between sword-bearers was a decision that would only be used as a last resort. Moreover, the duel required a powerful witness, a well-equipped arena, and a life-saving facility to carry out the duel. The law clearly stated that once one of the sword-bearer's personal shields was broken, the duel would immediately end. Moreover, it was impossible for the sword-bearers to be hurt in such a duel, not to mention dying in the hands of the sword-bearers. Similarly, it was clearly written in the history books that these rules regarding the internal struggles of the sword-bearers were set by the sword ancestor when Yin Jing City was destroyed and moved to the dimensional gap to live without purpose. No one could violate these rules. It had been more than 30 years since this rule was established in the dungeon. Logically speaking, this rule should have been properly implemented, even though this rule was not enforced due to the lack of supervision in the wilderness. However, the 12 skyscraping palaces were near New Yinjing City and were only a few dozen kilometers away from the city walls. The temporary camp was also managed by the Sword Council. This place should be a place with very strict rules. Why would someone dare to openly harm the lives of others in a duel here? At the thought of this, Gohan was no longer in a hurry to enter the 12 skyscraping palaces. Instead, he followed Wang Jiqiang to the temporary camp. When Gohan arrived at the temporary camp, he was shocked to discover that things were no longer as simple as a lack of supervision. There were more than a dozen arenas built with dimensional crystals in the camp. In each arena, there was a pair of sword-bearers fighting. Gohan also saw a few Blood Force corpses casually discarded outside some of the arenas. These corpses had clearly died not long ago, and their sword ladies had been forcibly broken beside them. Outside each ring, there were a large number of onlookers cheering loudly. Every time they saw a swordsman get injured or die, these onlookers would applaud and cheer excitedly, just like the spectators around the Colosseum in ancient Rome. Not only were the sword-bearers dead, but their sword ladies had also been broken. Seeing this, Gohan couldn't help but want to loudly question those cheering spectators and those ruthless opponents. Wasn't the sword lady the most precious treasure of mankind? It's fine if they killed your enemies, but why did they have to break such a precious sword lady? Everything here was so bloody and unbearable to look at, causing Gohan's worldview to be greatly impacted once again. Was this really the Kinzu rule that was praised by countless descendants in history books? Why was there such a bloody battle between sword-bearers? Could it be that these sword-bearers and the Sword Council behind them had forgotten that mankind's enemy wasn't mankind itself, but the crazy Yuan Ko outside who wanted to exterminate the entire human race? In just a few hours, Gohan felt that all his understanding of the Kinzu era had been completely shattered. Everything that happened here was completely different from what was written in the textbooks and history books. Even Gohan couldn't accept all of this in a short period of time. Why? Gohan asked himself in disappointment. Don't they know how to unite? Why do they have to kill each other? Why are you asking such an idiotic question? There's anger in the heart, and there's a sword in the hand. Naturally, they have to settle their debts. A sword-bearer beside Gohan heard Gohan's question and took the initiative to answer loudly. After asking the question, he stared provocatively at Gohan a few times and waved the sword lady in his hand, looking excited and eager to fight with Gohan. Unfortunately, Gohan didn't even look at this person. Instead, he quickly caught up with Wang Jiqiang, who was in front of him. Then he saw that on the leftmost ring, the sword-bearers who had walked with Gohan for a day were both bathed in blood. Their palms were tightly covering their chests, but they still couldn't stop the blood from flowing out of their chests. According to the rate of blood loss, even if they didn't receive any other injuries, in less than 3 minutes, these two people would both die. Old 3, Old 4. Wang Jiqiang cried out in sorrow and planned to rush to the ring to save these two people. Stop! The rules must be followed. However, before Wang Jiqiang could approach the ring, two sword ladies suddenly jumped out from the ground. Their swords were pointed at Wang Jiqiang's throat. Apparently, they didn't want Wang Jiqiang to continue approaching the ring. Looking at the strength of these two sword ladies, they should be spirit sword ladies. Two spirit sword ladies were naturally not something that Wang Jiqiang could deal with. If Wang Jiqiang wanted to take a step forward, their sharp swords could instantly cut off Wang Jiqiang's neck. Strange. How come I've never seen these two spirit sword ladies before? On the other side, Gohan couldn't help but stare blankly at the two sword ladies that had jumped out, because Gohan had never seen these two spirit sword ladies in the data. There were not many natural-born sword ladies of spirit sword level, and the man-made sword ladies were exactly the same as the natural-born sword ladies. Therefore, Gohan had almost memorized the appearance of all the sword ladies of spirit sword level in his mind. However, these two spirit sword ladies definitely didn't include these two spirit sword ladies in front of him. Hineo-chan, do you know who these two spirit sword level sword mistresses are? Just in case, Gohan confirmed with fragrant wind Hineo-chan. There's no information on these two sword ladies in the database. This time, even Tamono Kakashi didn't know what to say. I admit defeat. I admit defeat on behalf of the two of them. We've lost. On the other side, Wang Jiqiang, who was stopped by the two spirit sword ladies, hurriedly said to the two spirit sword ladies, "No, except for the two dueling parties. No one else is allowed to make a decision on their behalf." These two spirit sword ladies seemed to act as the referee, and they also ruthlessly rejected Wang Jiqiang's proposal. Old 3, Old 4, you guys admit defeat. Hurry up and admit defeat. Wang Jiqiang shouted at his two brothers from below the stage. Boss, I'm sorry. This time, I won't admit defeat even if I die. That's right, boss. Even if we die here, we won't admit defeat. Even though number 3 and number 4 were extremely weak, they bit their lips and refused to admit defeat no matter what. Why? Why won't you guys admit defeat? Could it be that your lives are not even comparable to a mere bargaining chip? Wang Jiqiang scolded, but he didn't expect that the two people on the stage still wanted to admit defeat, as if surrendering was related to something important. Then, Wang Jiqiang suddenly thought of something and hurriedly asked the two spirit sword ladies beside him, "What's the bargaining chip for their duel? If one side, Tian Hao, loses, then Tian Hao will kneel on the ground and tell the other side that Tian Hao is a son of a bitch, stinking dog shit." One of the spirit sword ladies replied, "One side of the duel is Old 3 Wu. If Old 4 Wu loses, then Old 3 Wu and Old 4 Wu will kneel on the ground and say to Tian how that Wang Jiqiang is a son of a B asterisk TCH, stinking dog shit." Another spirit sword grade sword mistress replied. Chapter 9:57. While Wang Jiqiang was being blocked by the spirit sword level sword ladies, the battle on the stage had already come to an end. A pale-faced sword madam pointed her sword at Wu Lao-san's chest, while the sword madam's wielder stood behind her and shouted, "Wu Lao-san, you idiot! If you kneel in front of this lord and say that Wang Jiqiang is a son of a bitch, stinking dog shit, this lord will spare your dog life. Otherwise, this lord will dig out your heart and feed it to the dogs." "Hey, Tian Hao, son of a bitch, stinking dog shit, this father's heart and liver are right here. Do whatever you want, but don't think of making this lord kneel." Old Wu San's words made Tian Hao angry. He turned to threaten Old Wu Si, but Old Wu Si and his brother had the same tone. They would rather die than kneel and beg for mercy. These two are real men. Hearing these two spirit sword level sword ladies say this, Gohan's eyes couldn't help but reveal a bit of praise. Just because they didn't want to kneel down and say bad things about their boss, these two men were actually willing to give up their lives. It seemed that although this era was not as orderly as his own era, the moral quality of the people seemed to be much stronger than the world of 1,000 years later. Under a strong order, there would inevitably be people haggling over every ounce. In the era of 1,000 years later, it was very rare to see such good men. I have to save these two. Out of admiration for these two brothers, Gahan decided to save their lives. Then the two of you can go die for me. Tian Hao's mouth curved into a sinister smile. The tip of his sword was ready to pierce Old Wu San and Old Wu Si's chests and dig out their hearts and liver. This was not a joke, nor was it a threat. Tian Hao really wanted to dig out other people's hearts and liver. For Tian Hao, this was not the first time he did this. In a flash, Tian Hao's sword tip was about to pierce Old Wu San's chest, and Old Wu San calmly closed his eyes, his whole body trembling, ready to die. Only a clear, clanging sound was heard. This was the sound of two swords colliding. Then, third bro Wu heard Tian Hao's exclamation. The curious third brother Wu hurriedly opened his eyes, only to find that Tian Hao, who had been swaggering in front of him, had fallen to the ground. As for the famed sword mistress, who had beaten third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu's sword mistress to the point that they were unable to fight back and had forcefully cut them in half, was lying on the ground. It was unknown whether she was dead or alive. The personal shield on the surface of her body had been completely shattered. A few seconds ago, when third brother Wu had closed his eyes, the personal shield of this sword mistress was the weakest. It was still at 70%, but in just a few seconds, it had been completely shattered. It seemed that she had been instantly killed by someone. It was no wonder that Tian Hao was so scared that he fell to the ground on his, but when the sword lady was crippled, the sword wielder was just a piece of trash. Who are you? Why are you interfering in our duel? Do you not want to live? Tian Hao asked in a threatening manner. Hearing Tian Hao's question, third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu noticed that there was a rather familiar young man blocking in front of them. Third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu rubbed their eyes and suddenly realized that this young man was the super expert military governor who had saved their team from danger a day ago. If it's this Sir Military Governor, then there's nothing strange about it. With Sir Military Governor's ability, he could even kill the dragon Rank Yuan Ko in one hit. Naturally, it would be easy for him to kill this famed sword mistress. Third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu thought to themselves. However, at the same time, third brother Wu and teacher Wu's expressions became a little anxious. They hurriedly said to Gahan, "Brother Military Governor, please leave this place quickly. We brothers are indebted to you for saving us. This is the arena. If you act rashly, you will cause a huge disaster. We appreciate your kindness, but please leave this place now. Otherwise, it will be too late." Actually, by the time third brother Wu and fourth brother Wu finished speaking, it was already too late. The two spirit sword mistresses who were blocking Wang Jiqiang flew into the arena and pointed their swords at Gohan's head. "Swordsman, you have broken the rules of the Lionian group. You have committed the crime of interfering in a duel. I hereby announce your arrest on behalf of the Lionian group. You will be sent to the Yinjing City's Labor Reform Bureau for 10 years without pay." Lionian group? It should be the Lionian family. The name confused Gahan for a moment. However, he seemed to understand something after thinking about it for a while. The Lionian family was called the Lionian family because they had thousands of years of inheritance and formed a huge family that was connected to their bloodline. Only then could they be called a family. However, the only adult in the Lionian family was Kenzu Lionian Li, and Lionian Li's biological son was only in his teens. There were only two people in the Lionian family. How could they be called a family? In reality, there were no families in the human world. It had only been 50 to 60 years since the apocalypse. At most, there were only 3 generations of people. Lionian Li's current faction was formed by his friends, disciples, subordinates, workers, and various other people. Therefore, it was only natural to call it the Lionian group. I remember a book from before the apocalypse. It said that the accumulation of power in the early stages of a faction is a bloody process. I didn't really understand this before, but I do now. Even the Lun Yin aristocratic family that everyone praises 1,000 years later and no one says anything bad about is built on these bloody arenas at this stage. Guhan said with great emotion. Since the two spirit sword mistresses were from the Liunian group, it was obvious that the arenas and even the entire camp were under the Liunian group's control. Therefore, it was obvious that the Liunian group was the one who set the rule that human lives were worthless. In the Liunian family's propaganda, the Liunian family's 1,000 years of history was as pure as a flawless white lotus, without the slightest blemish. The entire history was about how the Liunian family fought for humanity, how they spilled their blood and sacrificed their lives. They were like saints. Well, this was not without precedent. For example, the Confucians, the Chinese Empire's war against Japan, and the War of Liberation. Is the reality presented by this instance dungeon the truth? What was the world like before the great cultural destruction? Thinking about this, Guhan could not help but sigh. Then, he thought of the Gu Xuanwu of the past. Guhan could only hope that the Gu Xuanwu had returned to the era of Zhetian Jiandi. If that was the case, the great apocalypse would have passed, and humanity would have lived in an orderly society. He would not have returned to the era of Kinzu. Not only did the threat of Yuan Ko come from this era, but the greater threat came from the sword-bearers. Are you scared out of your wits? Where did this idiot come from? How dare you barge into the arena? Just you wait to die in the Yinjing City Labor Reform Bureau. Unknowingly, Tian Hao, who was trembling in fear, had already quietly hid behind the two spirit sword maidens. With the protection of the two spirit sword mistresses, Tian Hao immediately regained his confidence. He shouted at Guhan, as if he had completely forgotten about his pitiful appearance. This kind of person can be a sword-bearer? Guhan shook his head in disdain when he saw Tian Hao's reaction. It seemed that the sword-bearers of this era included men like Wu Laosan and Wu Laosan, as well as useless scoundrels like Tian Hao. If this was 1,000 years later, the sword-bearers might not be as loyal as Wu Laosan and Wu Laosan, but they would definitely not stoop to Tian Hao's level. Therefore, the sword-bearers did not simply rely on luck to choose their sword-bearers. Although the sword-bearers were in a deep sleep, they could instinctively sense the character of the sword-bearers. Those sword-bearers who were too despicable would generally not be chosen by the sword-bearers. Of course, this did not rule out the possibility that the sword-bearers were blind. The total number of people left in this era is probably less than 20 million, which is less than 1/10 of 1,000 years later. However, the number of sword-bearers is 7 times that of 1,000 years later. So, there's a total of 70 times difference. It is inevitable that some dregs will become sword-bearers. Guhan thought, sword-bearers, please immediately put down your weapon, hand over your sword-bearers, and come with us to the Administrative Bureau. The sword-bearers saw that there was no response from Guhan, so she took the initiative to urge him. I refuse. Guhan stared at the two spiritual sword-bearers indifferently. Unless you have the ability to kill me, no one can take away my sword-bearers from my hands. Do it. The two spiritual sword-bearers heard Guhan's words and didn't bother to say any more nonsense. The spiritual sword in their hands directly attacked Guhan. The sword momentum of these two swords was very sharp, directly approaching the vital parts of Guhan's body. Moreover, the sword moves were integrated into one. Generally, the sword-bearers had only two choices when they saw this sword. They could either use their own swords to resist this sword, or simply run away. In the eyes of Guhan before he entered the Guanghui amusement park, these two swords were indeed quite sharp. Guhan had to fully concentrate on his swordsmanship in order to fight against these two swords. At the same time, because the opponent was a spiritual sword-bearer, Guhan had to use a large amount of sword essence to be able to suppress the opponent's sword-bearers. However, in the eyes of the current Guhan, these two swords were somewhat ridiculous. Guhan raised the Qi-Dian sword in his hand and gently touched the sword heart of these two swords 2 inches to the left. These two spiritual sword-bearers were like two heavy trucks a moment ago, but at this time, it was as if someone had pushed a bicycle from the side. They staggered and twisted a few times on the ground, and the two spiritual sword-bearers directly fell to the ground. Shoo! Suddenly, a shoo sound came from below the arena. It turned out that when these two spiritual sword bearers fell, they accidentally exposed their underwear under their skirts. Chapter 958. Although the two spirit sword level sword ladies were lying on the ground, in fact, they didn't suffer much damage. This was like falling down from a bicycle. At most, it would be a slight bump, and it was impossible to cause any fatal injury. Therefore, these two spirit sword level sword ladies quickly got up from the ground. But what made Gohan feel strange was that these two spirit sword level sword ladies didn't show the embarrassed and angry expression that he had imagined. They still maintained the same indifferent expression as before, as if the humiliation of revealing their underwear just now didn't exist. Even if they were artificial sword ladies, after this kind of thing happened, they would more or less have some change in expression, especially the spirit sword level artificial sword ladies. This level of artificial sword ladies was very close to a normal natural sword lady, and they also had some emotions about the same as a child with low intelligence. Therefore, even if they were artificial sword ladies, after this kind of thing happened, they would inevitably show a completely different expression than before. But these two spirit sword level sword ladies were too indifferent, so indifferent that it made people feel that they weren't two sword ladies, but two plastic models. Do it! The two spirit sword rank sword maidens climbed up from the ground and once again fought with Gohan. Out of curiosity towards these two sword maidens, Gohan did not choose to quickly defeat them. Instead, he deliberately entangled with these two spirit sword rank sword maidens, wanting to observe the difference between these two sword maidens through battle. As a result, Gohan found that these two sword ladies were completely different from what Gohan had expected. In Gohan's expectation, these two spirit sword level sword ladies should be artificial sword ladies. But in the actual fight, Gohan found that he seemed to have made a mistake. These two spirit sword level sword ladies didn't seem to be artificial sword ladies. Artificial sword ladies had a very prominent feature, and that was their swordsmanship was stiff, without any spirituality, and would only mechanically obey the master's command to use swordsmanship. However, the swordsmanship of these two spirit sword level sword ladies was completely different. It was natural and smooth, without the slightest trace of stiffness and clumsiness, full of spirituality. This was clearly a swordsmanship that could only be used by two natural sword ladies. But to say that these two spirit sword level sword ladies were natural sword ladies, from their beautiful faces and expressions, they were simply more sword ladies than artificial sword ladies. Forget it. There's no need to continue observing. Gohan flicked the long sword in his hand, and a golden chrysanthemum blossomed on the blade of Gohan's sword of origin. The two spirit sword level sword ladies' personal shields burst like balloons in an instant. The moment their shields exploded, the two sword maidens fell to the ground as if they had been hit in the back by a heavy hammer, unable to get up from the ground. The moment these two spirit sword ladies fell to the ground, the audience that was just bustling with noise instantly froze. The whole venue was quiet, as if the whole world had disappeared. Am I seeing things? Two spirit sword maidens were actually defeated by a famed sword level sword wielder. One of the onlookers kept his mouth open as he spoke, not closing it at all. This sword wielder is a sword master. But even if he's a sword master, I've never heard of a sword master who could defeat two spirit sword level sword ladies. Another sword wielder also couldn't close his mouth. And that arrogant Tian Hao, the moment the two spirit sword level sword ladies were defeated, he slumped to the ground as if his spine had been pulled out. This was impossible. How could two spirit sword level sword ladies be defeated by a famed sword level sword wielder? This was impossible. However, Tian Hao wasn't the only one who felt that it was impossible. The other person on the stage also repeatedly exclaimed in his heart that it was impossible. This person was none other than Gohan, who had defeated the two spirit sword level sword ladies. This is the moment these two sword ladies were beaten to the ground. Gohan's whole body stiffened, and his mouth opened and closed in disbelief. Just now, Gohan saw something that he couldn't imagine. Just now, the moment these two spirit sword-level sword ladies fell to the ground, one of the sword lady's private parts flashed before Gohan's eyes. Anyway, in this flash, Gohan actually vaguely saw a small silver dot on that white thigh. This small dot might not be recognized by others, but Gohan clearly recognized it. Because this small dot was not something else, but it could be observed by Chi Dian's sword's basic skill, which allowed Chi Dian's sword to directly open the dimensional vortex and send Yuan Ko back to their own home. But the dimensional node was clearly something that only Yuan Ko had. Why was Gohan able to see a dimensional node on this spirit sword-level sword lady's body? Could it be? Gohan's body shivered, and Chi Dian's sword flashed out a sword light, and then the onlookers under the stage uniformly exclaimed and laughed in a way that only men could understand. The moment Gohan's sword light fell, the skirt of these two spirit sword-level sword ladies' lower body turned into pieces of cloth that fluttered in the air. Just like that, two beautiful absolute domains full of seductive aura were stripped of their own protection, except for a small pair of panties that wrapped tightly around their beautiful buttocks. The rest of their body parts were completely exposed to the onlookers. Of course, the reason why Gohan cut up the skirt of these two spirit sword-level sword ladies was not because Gohan was a pervert, but because Gohan wanted to confirm whether there was a dimensional node on the thighs of these two sword ladies. As a result, when Gohan clearly saw the thighs of these two spirit sword-level sword ladies, he found that the thighs of the other party were as smooth as jade, and he couldn't see the existence of the dimensional node at all. Could it be that my eyes are playing tricks on me? Gohan touched his nose, and just as he was about to cut up the clothes of these two sword ladies to look for more, from an inconspicuous room in the temporary camp, two extremely strong auras suddenly burst out. Not good. It's an immortal sword-level sword lady. As soon as these two auras burst out, Gohan knew that he had poked a hornet's nest. An immortal sword-level sword lady could travel through the void to launch an attack. This was no longer a problem that swordsmanship could deal with. Even if Gohan could defeat 10,000 spirit sword-level sword ladies, he would not be a match for an immortal sword-level sword lady. Therefore, Gohan grabbed Old Wu San and Old Wu Si, who were next to him, stuffed a nano capsule into each of their mouths, and then directly threw them to the side of Wang Jiqiang, who was under the stage, and immediately flew away from the stage. Little thief, how dare you? The void next to Gohan suddenly split open to reveal a large door. Half a figure walked out of the void and aimed a sword at Gohan's back. This process was extremely fast, several times faster than the blink of an eye. Ordinary people would not be able to react at all. However, at this critical moment, Gohan turned around and slashed. In an instant, the crowd felt as if they had seen stars in the sky. When the stars gradually dissipated, the battle had quietly ended. Gohan, who was near the stage a second ago, had now reached the main entrance of the Mouse Palace. And the immortal sword-level sword lady had also walked out of the void, her eyes fixed on Gohan. TSK, this guy is so smart. He actually hid in the skyscraping 12 palaces. This is fleeting Jindi's territory. Which immortal sword-level sword lady would dare to fight in there? One of the onlookers praised. It's not just a matter of strength. Didn't you see that this guy was hit by the immortal sword-level sword lady in the void just now? Not only did he escape, but he also appeared at the entrance of the Mouse Palace unscathed. Not to mention other things, just this strength alone. Not to mention a famed sword-level swordsman. Even among the spiritual sword-level swordsmen, he would be one of the best, another swordsman praised. Right, speaking of spiritual sword-level swordsmen, who do you think is stronger, this swordsman or the cardinal sword spirit? That swordsman asked curiously. That's hard to say. The swordsman calculated in his heart. If this famed sword-level swordsman can become a spiritual sword-level swordsman, then this swordsman is naturally stronger. However, he is only a famed sword-level swordsman now. I think he might have a 20% chance of fighting the cardinal sword spirit to a draw. The topic about Gohan continued for a while. Everyone was discussing how strong this famed sword-level swordsman was, and which major force or organization he belonged to. Suddenly, a thunderous roar came from the sky. The loud sound attracted everyone's attention. The sound came from the depths of the skyscraping mountain. After the thunder stopped, a palace that looked like a crouching monkey slowly appeared from the top of the skyscraping mountain. It looked like a mirage. This is the ninth palace. Everyone who saw this scene gasped. Since 2 years ago, everyone was used to the 8 palaces on the skyscraping mountain. They even felt that even after the skyscraping 12 palaces disappeared, there would only be 8 palaces on the skyscraping mountain. Unexpectedly, the peace of the skyscraping 12 palaces was broken today. A brand new 9th palace of the skyscraping 12 palaces that no one had ever seen before actually appeared in front of everyone. This big event instantly replaced the topic that Gahan had brought. Everyone was discussing the sudden appearance of the 9th palace. The question that everyone was most concerned about was who had activated the 9th palace. According to the rules, only after successfully breaking through the 8th palace would the next palace appear on the skyscraping mountain. It's the Cardinal Sword Spirit. There's no doubt about it. It's definitely the Cardinal Sword Spirit. A swordsman shouted excitedly. I saw the Cardinal Sword Spirit enter the Mouse Palace this morning. Now that I think about the time, it's exactly when the Cardinal Sword Spirit broke through the 7th palace. It's definitely the Cardinal Sword Spirit. It must have broken through the 8th palace and activated the 9th palace. That's right. It must be the Cardinal Sword Spirit. Yes, it's definitely the Cardinal Sword Spirit. Everyone expressed their agreement. This was because in the entire world, only the Cardinal Sword Spirit had broken through the 7th palace. The others were at most wandering around the 6th palace. Only the Cardinal Sword Spirit could break through the 7th palace and enter the 8th palace. This must be it. Chapter 959. An hour after the sudden appearance of the 9th palace, a streak of light flew down from the 8th palace on Skyscraper Mountain and returned to the temporary campsite. It's a spirit sword-level swordsman. Maybe the Cardinal Sword Spirit is back. A swordsman shouted loudly, causing a commotion in the crowd. To be able to fly in the sky, it must be a spirit sword-level swordsman. There weren't many spirit sword-level swordsmen who entered the 12 palaces. Plus, the figure flew down from the 8th palace, so these swordsmen naturally guessed that this figure was the Cardinal Sword Spirit. Just as the sword wielder had guessed, when this figure revealed its true appearance, it would be the world-famous Cardinal Sword Spirit. The crowd immediately surrounded the Cardinal Sword Spirit tightly, and then began to ask the Cardinal Sword Spirit if he had passed through the 8th palace and entered the 9th palace. Being surrounded by a large group of people was a very painful thing, making it difficult for the Cardinal Sword Spirit to breathe. But it could be seen that the Cardinal Sword Spirit actually enjoyed the feeling of being surrounded by people. Especially when he was asked if he had passed through the 8th palace, the Cardinal Sword Spirit immediately flipped his hair handsomely, then deliberately pretended to be humble and said, "These 2 years I've studied hard and finally made some achievements. I didn't expect to shock everyone." Although the Cardinal Sword Spirit didn't directly admit that he had passed through the 8th palace, it was more or less telling everyone that he had indeed passed through the 8th palace. The entire crowd immediately cheered. Under the guidance of a few people, most people raised their hands and clenched their fists towards the sky. At the same time, they shouted the Cardinal Sword Spirit's name and cheered for the Cardinal Sword Spirit's victory. The Cardinal Sword Spirit persuaded everyone not to do this, but at the same time, his face was smiling like a chrysanthemum. This was probably the happiest moment of the Cardinal Sword Spirit's life. After the cheers passed, curious people began to ask the Cardinal Sword Spirit what it was like inside the 9th palace and what kind of test there was. Because no one had ever entered the 9th palace, when this question was asked, the crowd immediately became silent. Everyone stopped talking and instead pricked up their ears to listen to the Cardinal Sword Spirit's answer. This way, they would know what kind of test there was in the mysterious 9th palace. Well, I'm ashamed. The Cardinal Sword Spirit's expression changed slightly. He touched the back of his head and said, shamefully, I had just entered the ninth palace for a few minutes before I failed and was ejected from the ninth palace. Everyone saw it just now. I flew back a few minutes after the ninth palace appeared. How could I have figured out what was going on inside? What surprised the Cardinal Sword Spirit was that after he finished speaking, the crowd that was cheering around him suddenly became silent. Although the people who were prepared to listen to his answer were also silent, the Cardinal Sword Spirit could clearly feel a sense of excitement and curiosity. But now, under this silence, the Cardinal Sword Spirit felt an indescribable strangeness. Cardinal Sword Spirit, are you sure you've only passed through the eighth palace for a few minutes? After the Cardinal Sword Spirit felt strange for more than 10 seconds, a brave, famed sword-level swordsman broke the silence and spoke. What does that mean? When the Cardinal Sword Spirit heard this question, he felt that something was wrong. He immediately understood the question behind this question. Could it be that the ninth palace has appeared for a long time? The Cardinal Sword Spirit's tone was still very calm, but there was something wrong hidden under this calmness. This is an hour long? This swordsman probably knew that he might have said something that made the Cardinal Sword Spirit unhappy. Although he did not want to answer this question, he really wanted to run away from the Cardinal Sword Spirit. However, looking at the Cardinal Sword Spirit's piercing gaze, the sword wielder knew that he could not escape. If he really ran away, he would not have a good ending. Thus, the sword wielder could only reply with a trembling voice. That's right, an hour. You're saying that the ninth palace appeared an hour ago? The Cardinal Sword Spirit took a few steps back, as if he was heavily injured. His gaze once again moved from the dense crowd to the majestic sky-scraping mountain and the 9 palaces that stood on top of sky-scraping mountain. He did indeed pass through the 8th palace a few minutes ago, but the 9th palace appeared an hour ago. Didn't this mean that the first person to pass through the 8th palace was not him, the Cardinal Sword Spirit? Seeing the Cardinal Sword Spirit's strange reaction, some of the sword bearers were confused, but some of the sword bearers quickly understood. So this Cardinal Sword Spirit was not the first swordsman to pass through the 8th palace. It turned out that they were chasing the wrong person. This way, the entire scene fell into a very awkward situation. Although the surrounding crowd was very awkward, the most awkward person was probably the Cardinal Sword Spirit, who was surrounded in the middle. At this time, the Cardinal Sword Spirit really wanted to escape, but he was completely surrounded and could not squeeze out of the crowd at all. But if the crowd dispersed and let the Cardinal Sword Spirit go, then the Cardinal Sword Spirit would probably be even more awkward. He would be so awkward that he would want to find a hole to hide in. But very quickly, the Cardinal Sword Spirit's awkwardness was resolved. This was because at this time, the rumbling sound that he had heard before was heard again. A new palace appeared on sky-scraping mountain. Oh my God! 2 sky-scraping palaces appeared in one day. A swordsman said hoarsely, "Is that the 10th palace?" The Cardinal Sword Spirit seemed to have forgotten his own awkwardness. He stared at the palace that suddenly appeared. No one knew what he was thinking. Next, let's turn our attention back to our main character, Gahan. After Gahan used chaotic stars to successfully block the Sword Maiden's attack, he used the Sword Maiden's power to rush into the Mouse Palace. This was because Gahan knew that after offending an immortal sword-rank sword lady, only the heaven-towering 12 palaces would be safe in the entire heaven-towering mountain. Even an immortal sword-rank sword lady would not dare to break the rules set by the sword ancestor. And this also meant that Gahan had embarked on a path that could only be moved forward. Gahan had to pass through all of the 12 sky-scraping palaces in one go. If Gahan failed, he would not be allowed to step into the 12 sky-scraping palaces territory for the next day. In other words, Gahan had to stay in the temporary camp for 2 days. This was enough time for the Sword Maiden to capture Gahan 10 times. Gahan had already learned about the 12 sky-scraping palaces. He knew that the difficulty of the 12 sky-scraping palaces was higher than the previous one. An ordinary famous sword-tier swordsman would probably wander around the 1st and 2nd palaces. A top famous sword-tier swordsman could break through the 3rd and 4th palaces. A spirit sword-tier swordsman could struggle in the 5th and 6th palaces. Only the strongest spirit sword-tier swordsman, such as the cardinal sword spirit, could break through the 7th and 8th palaces and advance towards the 9th palaces. Each of the 12 sky-scraping palaces had its own different characteristics according to its name. For example, the first palace, the Mouse Palace, was characterized by the wave-like mice in front of Gahan. It was said that if a mouse couple was given enough food and safety in a perfect environment without considering various diseases, they could reproduce 350 offspring in a year. And these 350 offspring were in pairs. In the second year, each pair could reproduce 350 offspring. So in 10 years, all the mice born were enough to fill up the entire space in Asia. The mice in the Mouse Palace were probably in the same situation. They had been living in the Mouse Palace without any worries for 10 years. The whole Mouse Palace was densely packed with mice, and these mice were constantly running. The whole ground was like a turbulent black sea. Every wave could roll up thousands of mice. If people with trypophobia and mouse phobia saw this scene, they would probably have a heart attack and die on the spot. And this was the test of the Mouse Palace. Of course, the Mouse Palace did not want to use these mice to test your courage. The rules to clear the Mouse Palace were clearly written at the entrance of the Mouse Palace. Participants, individually, walk along the yellow line from the entrance to the exit without actively touching any of the mice, and you'll be able to clear the Mouse Palace. This rule sounded quite simple, but it was very difficult to actually do it. This was because the ground of the Mouse Palace was densely packed with mice. Most of the time, these mice covered the entire ground. There was only a small space on the ground that was the size of a toe. The contestants were absolutely not allowed to hurt these mice. Over the past 10 years, the mice here had obviously figured out the rules here, so they were not afraid of any human who entered the Mouse Palace. Under normal circumstances, the mice would immediately panic and flee once they saw a human. They were like old grandpas and grannies taking a leisurely walk, completely ignoring these ridiculous humans. The contestants could only rely on the small space that was the size of their toes to move forward step by step. In the process, they were not allowed to touch any mice. Fortunately, the rules included the words actively touching. Otherwise, even if the contestants did not touch the mice themselves, the lively mice would take the initiative to rub against their feet, and all their previous efforts would be in vain. What was worse was that the test of the Mouse Palace required everyone, including the sword-bearers, to walk through the entire path of the Mouse Palace. This caused the sword-bearers, who usually relied on the sword ladies, to be instantly at a loss. No matter how beautiful the sword ladies were, they could not carry their sword-bearers through the Mouse Palace. Obviously, the Mouse Palace tested the sword-bearers' movement skills. For example, the dozen sword-bearers in front of Gahan seemed to be walking on a steel wire. They slowly moved forward on their tiptoes. Their bodies swayed, and if they were not careful, they would lose their balance and fall to the ground, crushing one or two unlucky mice. Then, they would be caught by a sword aura that appeared out of thin air in the Mouse Palace and thrown out of the palace. Sigh, this is the 36th time. Don't tell me that I, Wang Qingxiang, can't pass the first palace before the 12 skyscraping palaces disappear. The sword-bearer who was thrown out touched his but an annoyance. At that moment, he was very unhappy to see a pair of eyes staring at him. Wang Qingxiang felt offended. He immediately stood up and scolded. "What are you looking at? Go over yourself if you can. I walked a few hundred meters. You can only walk 10 meters at most. Then, you'll be thrown out. Let's see who will laugh at who then. Goodbye." The person smiled at Wang Qingxiang. Then his body flew out like a light willow catkin. This time, he flew a distance of dozens of meters. Then, he lightly tapped the ground with the tip of his foot, and his entire body once again flew tens of meters away. The whole process was extremely fast. There was no pause or hesitation in the middle. When Wang Qingxiang rubbed his eyes in disbelief and looked carefully, the person was already standing at the exit of the Mouse Palace. He waved at Wang Qingxiang and disappeared. "Oh my God, I'm at a big shot, Wang Chengxiang said in shock. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.